Yes, it was nice seeing people last night and a little strange.
Yeah. It's very weird when you see people that you've only seen on Zoom.
And surprisingly hard to recognize people at times.
Well, masks also make it
Yes.
difficult, right? Because then you're only looking at the eyes.
Or even sometimes if you've seen people only from the neck up.
That's true too.
All right, so I was just going to say, let's give it a couple of moments
Yeah.
for people to
Yeah,
filter in.
I agree.
Well, even if people aren't able to be here in person, I think our board members hopefully know, and I think the fact that this meeting is recorded and will be available for viewing will at least allow people to see what's
What?
what.
Yes.
Okay, we're all streaming and ready to go. So,
Well, you know what? While we're waiting a couple more minutes, Aida, just to, since it's just 6:31, do you want to do the intro comments on procedure?
Sure, absolutely. Give me 1 second. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the July 22nd Congestion Pricing Task Force meeting. My name is Saida Harrigan, and I'll be moderating the technical aspects of tonight's meeting. A few notes for you, particularly if this is your first meeting with us. You'll notice that you are muted and unable to mute yourself. You will only be unmuted by the prompting of the co-chairs. You can ask to be recognized by raising your virtual hand, and you can do that by going to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and selecting raise hand. It's important not to raise your physical hands or wave at the screen because we may not be able to see you among the participants. If you are on a phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9 and *6 to unmute. Once you're recognized by the co-chair, I will unmute you and you may be prompted to confirm unmuting on your device. If you're using an older version of Zoom, you can access the raise hand feature by clicking the participants button on the bottom of your screen and selecting raise hand. Just to note, the chat function is available for technical support only, not to ask questions of the co-chairs. You can send me a chat if you're having any trouble and I'll walk you through any issues you may be having. And so with that, I'll pass the mic to co-chairs Alita Camp and Craig Lader.
Thank you. I'll just say a brief hello and welcome. There's a lot going on with congestion pricing. Craig is about to give an update. So we're glad that you're here. Craig?
Thank you. Before I begin, Saida, if you possible, can you send me the direct link to the Zoom? Our speaker tonight, for whatever reason, is unable to get access to the link once he completes the survey. Okay. So I'm just trying to get it to him. So he gets the survey, but doesn't get a link apparently. So I'm trying to wait. Let me see. I just got a new message. So if you could,
I just sent it to you.
Okay, thank you. I apologize, everyone. Technical difficulties. Let me, and I'm not great at multitasking, so I realize as I try to pass it along.
You know what? People have been joining in the meantime, so if everyone is patient, it's just as well.
Yes.
I'm just going to turn on some background lights here. I'll be right back.
Okay. Thank you, Said. I got it. I'm passing it along. And then Okay. So hopefully by the time I provide this update, our speaker will be in attendance. And let me just start. Well, I guess, good evening, everyone. I was, before our presentation, just going to provide a few updates. If anyone's been following the news, you've seen that that congestion pricing has been in the news over the past week or so. Let me just pull up my my updates. I just realized I had it open and it closed. Apparently I'm super organized tonight. Here we go. So there was some action in terms of the Traffic Mobility Review Board. The mayor made his one appointment that he is permitted, and that was the Department of Finance Commissioner Sharif Saliman. I'm not familiar with him or where he resides and if he's going to represent our interest. The Mobility Review Board was required to have people who had expertise in either finance or transportation. So he, I guess, fits the bill from that perspective. But I don't know that he fits our bill in terms of what we are looking for, although I think the intention was always to ensure that we had people who were appointed on a state level as well that would represent north of 60th Street. The mayor, when announcing that, also has been ramping up his promotion of congestion pricing and urging congestion pricing to be implemented as soon as possible. He announced his hope that it would be in effect by July 2022, so 1 year from now. I don't know that that is feasible. And if, for those of you who were in attendance last month and saw Senator Liz Krueger speak, she believes we are on an 18-month trajectory, which also is potentially not going to happen if the state continues to not really be aggressive in its implementation efforts. There have been some rumblings that the governor is not really pushing it, and there was an MTA spokesman that said, quote, "We are early into the process and working closely with the Federal Highway Administration and our partners at New York City DOT and New York State DOT to make sure this important project can be implemented as soon as possible. An environmental assessment is complicated, and we're working through issues with the Federal Highway Administration and our partners at the New York City and New York State Departments of Transportation." So they're not necessarily moving aggressively at this point to move it forward. And with elections in November 2022 at the governor level and state legislator level, that may not be providing much of an incentive for people to be moving forward with this. But then back home, we have the Democratic mayoral primary winner, Eric Adams, who, in response to last week's flooding issues in the subway, made clear that he is on board with congestion pricing and thinks it should be fast-tracked and that funds should be used to address subway station resiliency needs. So we now see positions that are becoming clearer, at least on a political level. And then one last note on the state level, the state also has yet to reach out to New Jersey officials as they are required to do, and they've only met once with Connecticut officials. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and it's unclear as to how that is going to play out. And then finally, I just want to provide one clarification that I don't know was completely evident last month. So we keep talking about the $15 billion that congestion pricing is going to raise. But in terms of revenue generation, congestion pricing is expected to generate $1 billion annually. And the idea is that that $1 billion is going to be used to secure bonds totaling $15 billion. So that number doesn't sound as daunting when you think about it as $1 billion to be raised as opposed to $15 billion annually. So I just want to make sure that we all understood that that was what the law stated, because I think I was even confused beforehand and wasn't completely aware of that. So those are the updates that I have since last month. And I don't know if anyone has any questions now, or if they wish to hold off on their questions until after the presentation, in case we may be able to learn more and then build beyond where we are right now. Sorry, more technical difficulties. I'm trying to just check our.
Craig, I think you're frozen.
I was waiting for someone else to move so I could see. I didn't know it wasn't my computer. But yes, Craig.
Oh, now his video is out.
Since Craig was taking charge of this, I need to defer to him. He's just left. So
I think he's back.
is he back?
Sorry, everyone.
There you are.
Okay.
Okay, I don't know what happened, but I apparently got kicked off and I'm back. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I'm glad you're back. I was just saying that we had to wait for you. So you were very quick.
All right. So unless there's anything else that anyone or any comments anyone needs to make now, I think we can move on to our presentation. All right, so not seeing any hands. So I would like to just remind everyone. So last month I indicated that I had someone in mind who may be able to talk with our task force and present some quantitative data regarding congestion pricing and its impact from cities in which it's been implemented. So I reached out to this person that I had met at a conference, and she actually then indicated that she was more familiar or an expert on the policy side of it, but she steered me towards someone who I'm very honored to introduce as tonight's speaker. And this is Professor Louis Lee, who is an assistant professor in the Transportation Systems Group of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. He's originally from Irondale, Alabama, and holds an MA in Transport Economics from University of Leeds and a master's and PhD degree in Civil Engineering from UC Berkeley. Professor Lee's research focuses on the economics and physics of traffic in cities, including issues related to congestion pricing. His research paper, Downtown Congestion Pricing in Practice, will be the foundation for much of his presentation today. I've spoken with him at length over the past month, and I think he has a very clear understanding of what our task force here is interested in learning. And since he doesn't have any skin in the game except for a sibling that lives in Long Island City, he's well equipped to give a fact-based and quantitative back presentation and be able to answer any questions that our group may have. So Said, if you could unmute Professor Louis Lee, and I don't know if he wants to share his screen.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, very good. I got a podcast microphone for this. So. All right, I will share.
Thank you for your patience and with the.
Sure. Can y'all see? Do y'all see the presentation, or do you see the speaker view?
We see the presentation.
All right, great. All right, well, I really appreciate y'all having me here. I recently, I go to New York City sometimes. I recently went to Roosevelt Island for the first time. I rode the tram out there, and it was very beautiful, especially when you get off the tram and you go north into the sort of neighborhood. I really liked it. All right, anyway, so what I'm going to talk about is something I've studied a lot. I'm just going to basically review the cases of what I call downtown congestion pricing. So okay, so what is congestion pricing? Congestion pricing is basically just a broad term. There's a lot of synonyms for it, but it's basically using tolls to, in some way, to control traffic and to try to reduce the bad things that come with traffic, such as pollution, accidents, delays, things like that. So the downtown congestion pricing we're going to talk about is not the most common application, at least in the United States. Here, you much more often see things like lanes on freeways that are tolled in such a way to achieve usually flow targets or speed targets, and they sometimes call them express lanes, value lanes, hot lanes. I think in New York, they're called hot lanes, but it just varies across the country. But typically, the way it is y'all can see my my little laser pointer here. Typically, the way that these express lanes or hot lanes work is that you have the free lanes on one side, and then you have the option of paying to go into the tolled lanes. What is downtown congestion pricing? It's a term that I use to refer to congestion pricing in a downtown area. And it's actually pretty different than doing it on tolled lanes on a freeway because you have to set up a zone, which involves often a lot more ins and outs and in like points that you can go in and out of the zone. And it's also different in that you can't really have a free option so much as there's not like another downtown right next to it that can be free. And then there's like a tolled downtown. You can't have tolled lanes along every single street. So it is a bit trickier and there's fewer of these systems. So it's been implemented in 5 cities. And I'll talk about those cases. There's Singapore, London, Stockholm, Milan, and Gutenberg, which is the second biggest city in Sweden. So, mainly in Europe so far. So New York City would be the first case in North America. The technologies used, there's basically 3 major ones that are used today. They're the automatic number plate recognition cameras, the cameras that can identify the license plate and charge an account. They're often already used for enforcement. And then the second one is RFID, which is in New York, I believe it's called Easy Pass. Here it's called iPass. The sort of the radio frequency transponder, the little tag that you put on your window. And then the last one, which it's going to be deployed in Singapore soon, is like GPS based ones, but there aren't any cases of that right now. Okay, so the first, I'm going to talk, the way I'm going to go is I'm going to go kind of quickly, and then I figure that y'all could just like ask questions, but also feel free if there's some kind of clarification, if I use some term you don't understand, feel free to butt in. I'm a professor, so my students speak up all the time, so it's no big deal. So the first system is actually really old, Singapore Area License Scheme. You can see that it's 1975 in Singapore. Basically, it was implemented. It's very simple. It was just that they stationed people in a little ring around the downtown, and you had to buy this little like piece of paper with a color and a design that was, for a certain day. And then, they would just check and make sure that you had it. If you didn't have it, they'd write down your license plate. And it was only for 2 hours during the morning time, but it was actually extremely effective. So at discouraging private car traffic, it was only applicable to just regular private cars, and actually carpools were exempt. So it was very surprising, actually. A lot of people switched to carpooling in that, but it was a very small system, very simple, not a very miniature version of the kind of thing that you're looking at. So then basically nothing happened from 1975 other than they just kept sort of adapting that scheme, enlarging it, making it a bit more complicated, getting rid of exemptions. So then in the 90s, Singapore switched over to 1997, they switched over to something called electronic road pricing, ERP, which is still in Singapore. So basically electronic road pricing is, at first blush, you might think it's similar to using an Easy Pass, but it's actually a bit different in that for various reasons, it being so early and for various political reasons, they went with this design where you basically load money on a card that you can use for the metro or whatever. And then there's a card reader and you stick it in there and then they charge you. But it's essentially similar to an iPass. So you get charged when you drive under one of these gantries like that. And there's like 80 or 100 gantries. They move them around all the time, but they're placed all over the island. So that system has a distinguishing feature that the rates, they vary by the time of day. They don't vary in real time like some of the express lanes do in the United States, but they do update them like quarterly, every 3 months to achieve certain speed targets, but people know what they'll be in advance. And as you can see, it varies. This is just one gantry. It will vary by 2018, they vary pretty sharply over the course of the day. So do they achieve their speed targets? Yes. So Singapore is not for such a large global city relative to, most of the global cities that you'll go to, it's not, they do tend to achieve their speed targets. And that's not just, obviously, it's not just electronic road pricing that does that. They have a giant package of policies involved in that. So I'm just given like one small part of everything that Singapore does to get rid of traffic, but they take it very seriously. The next city is about 5 or 6 years later, the London Congestion Charge, which if you've been to London, you've driven around, you might have had to deal with. It's basically here, it's in this is kind of like the area like where they would have Big Ben and Parliament and things like this, really the very middle of the city of the larger area of London. And it launches in February 2003. It's a system that charges you even for travel within a zone. So even if you were to just drive your car, instead of just going across a boundary, even if you were to just drive your car from there to there, you would still have to pay. And the way that they do that is actually that they have these ANPR cameras, not only along the border of the zone, but they actually have them dispersed all throughout the zone. So they have these cameras everywhere. They even have cameras on like vans that drive around. So we call it a daily license because effectively you pay once to go into the zone and then you can go in and out all day. It's not for crossing a boundary. It's just for the permission to drive in the zone on that day. It's a weekday from about 7 in the morning to 6 o'clock at night. So it's got a lot of cameras. Over time, it has increased in price to manage traffic and keep up with inflation and such. Started out at £5, now it's $11.50. And it raises a substantial amount of money, much smaller than the kind of sums that y'all are talking about. There's not as much, this is not as big of dense of an area as Lower Manhattan, but there's about in the neighborhood of, depending on what the pound is, would be like around 300 to 400 million a year. And they dedicate it to Transport for London, and they spent most of the money on bus service improvements. But something I want to emphasize also is that these policies are hardly ever never implemented in a vacuum. So when they established it, they actually did a lot of street redesigns, especially around the border of the zone, to try to, for various reasons. They had a lot of pedestrian improvements, bus lanes. So there was a lot going on. This was only part of a big reformation of London's transport system. It's still kind of ongoing. Anyway, so the effect of this is where we get a lot of statistics because Singapore doesn't publish quite as many statistics. The big thing was that private car traffic, which is what is actually subject to it, because much traffic is exempt. The private car traffic fell by about 30%. By traffic, I mean vehicles going into the zone. Some of the other types of traffic that were exempt actually increased. One of the main things they wanted to do is they wanted to improve travel times. They did improve, if you can see this line right here. So, well, right there, maybe I should have stopped on this more. These red bars are cars and what they call mini cabs. You can see the really sharp drop off. This is like, every 3 months, these are quarters. So you can see this very sharp drop off when they implement the London congestion charge. And it just basically stays constant. It declines a little bit over time, but the real story is just this big drop upon implementation. These other types of traffic, like you can see big increases in cycling. Some other types of traffic that are exempt, such as buses and coaches. These are basically motorcycles and taxis and such. They actually kind of increase a little bit. But anyway, so that's the story. So they were targeting private cars. They did get a large drop in private car traffic. And then from private car traffic, you run into, well, there's less vehicles. Hopefully the delay is reduced. And that's a big goal of doing this. And they did see, at least initially, a big drop off in, these are called travel times. So this is kind of the inverse of speed. It's how long it takes to go a kilometer. And as you can see here, this is not the speed falling. This is the one over the speed falling. So when this goes down, speed goes up. So you can see here, it goes down quite a bit, right, when congestion charging starts, but then over time, it starts to creep back up. And actually, by about 2007, 2008, basically the speeds, the travel times inside the zone were back to where they were. And there's various explanations for that. One is that it's a very deliberate policy. They reduced speed limits in the zone and around the zone. And They also took a lot of lane space away from private cars. They gave it to pedestrian infrastructure, cycle lanes, bus lanes, things like that. They also permitted a lot more construction that blocked the road and changed them. They did a lot of road works, basically. And then finally, there's something that New York has struggled with, and basically every city has struggled with, is the fact that this coincided about, with the sort of the arrival of the delivery economy. And also, when I say for hire vehicles, that includes TNC trips. So they would, or what they call mini cabs. So that includes a lot more Ubers in there, and also other TNCs. So they have these kind of trends against them. So today they kind of speak of it as something that, in spite of these trends, prevented traffic from being worse. But if you drive in London, you will not experience very fast traffic today. And also, I would add that I'll talk about some knock-on effects. Part of these knock-on effects is that there's less people driving, a lot less people driving down there. So you do see less pollution of the types of vehicles that were targeted, mainly cars, but because of the exemptions for like things like buses, motorcycles, black cabs, they have seen an increase in like NO2 emissions that come from burning diesel. And then the other thing is that accidents went down very sharply. It was sort of more effective than they had anticipated as far as reducing accidents. So when we say that accidents went down, we can really mean two things. One is that just the total number of accidents goes down, and the second one is that your chance of getting an accident if you do drive goes down. And they saw a decrease in those two things. So those were positive knock-on effects. So then the next city is Stockholm in Sweden. Right here we see a map of Stockholm. As you can see, it's kind of like New York in that it does not, or at least the Manhattan, where it is geographically, it's on a series of these islands, and it's kind of an archipelago. So it's a bit easier to do it there than in some other places like London. So these are all the points that they use to toll. It's enforced by automatic number plate recognition, just like London is, but unlike London, they only have you only get charged for crossing sort of the border into the zone. You don't get charged for driving around inside of it. And also you get charged each time you cross the border. Raised about $200 million per year. And what do they use the money for? They built they spend it on transit improvements, and then also a bypass. They're trying to build a bypass to help truck and freight traffic basically go around Stockholm. It involves a bunch of tunnels. It's very complicated. But this one is similar to the Singapore electronic road pricing case, and that it varies over the course of the day, although not quite as much. So today it's the blue line. You can see it goes up very sharply at the peaks. And then in the middle of the day, it's kind of medium. And then, it goes down at the beginning and the end of the day. As for what were the effects, here we look at a similar chart than what we did for London, although they don't have as much data as London did. But basically the take home from this one is that these bars represent delay. The hashed lines are when there was tolling. The dark line is when there was not tolling. You can see that for various types of roads in the city of Stockholm, the delay was lower when they had the pricing. There's a middle bar right there because actually they had it as a trial, and they had it as a trial for about 7 months, and then after the trial it went away, and there was kind of there was a referendum to see if they wanted to make it permanent. It's kind of a complicated story, and then the people voted to approve it. But here you can also see this is just cars going into Stockholm. This is 2005 is before the charges. And after that, every month of the year, you just see less vehicles going into Stockholm. So one of the very interesting parts of this is that the one in London was done essentially, but in Singapore, it was done essentially by fiat, by the government. London, it was done they elected a mayor, but then once Ken Livingstone was the mayor, he enforced it by fiat. This is the first case where there's a lot of public opinion involved. And basically these are people that support it. And right before implementation, it becomes very unpopular. Everybody is very skeptical. The media is kind of against it. And there's a lot of papers about this turnaround in public opinion that sort of once it is implemented, people get more comfortable with it and the public opinion kind of goes up. And that's how it passed the referendum. So moving on to the next case is Milan in Italy. So one of the things about this is an interesting case because whereas the other cases that we looked at were fairly focused on basically this same goals as New York City. Maybe the main goal is reducing congestion, car traffic, having too many cars on the road. In Milan, basically the motivation was this air pollution problem that they have. I've never been to Milan, but I understand that it's one of the most polluted cities in Western Europe. It's not really their fault, as you can see here. Actually, I found these graphs of air pollution. It has to do with this valley that they're in. It's kind of like Salt Lake City, where the exhaust gets trapped in this valley, so it's hard for them to get to. No matter what they do, it's hard for them to not have pollution unless there was just no emissions. But anyway, so they had this problem. It was causing a big health crisis and everything. So they declared kind of an emergency, and they launched it. And they did a lot of things, but as part of it, they did this thing called EcoPass, which was basically very similar to the London congestion charge, a smaller area, but around sort of the historic center of Milan. And I haven't been there, like I said, but apparently these are old like walls of a fortification from like the 1400s. And but basically, if you go into this area, you have to pay. But if you pay once for the day, that allows you to go in and out. So they launched this EcoPass. And the EcoPass, because its purpose is to get rid of pollution, it's very targeted towards the most polluting vehicles, and it has a lot of exemptions to it. So actually, after a couple of years, basically people had switched out their vehicles and their routes and such. So after about 4 years, this is the exempt traffic, number of vehicles going in per day. The blue line is the charge traffic. You can see that by the 4th year, there's very little of the charge traffic, and basically almost all the traffic is exempt. So no one's really paying this thing. But they still have an air pollution problem. So they basically reformed it in 2012. They had a popular referendum to reform it and do other things for air pollution. And when they did that, they switched it over to a simpler system that's less targeted at polluting vehicles. It's more just like much more vehicles have to pay. It's called Area C, but it has the same design and the same boundaries, just fewer exemptions essentially. There is a lot more revenue, and they used it to build primarily what they call pedestrianization, like things to make it easier to walk around and to bike. And also they built some new tram lines that were inside the zone. The pollution impacts, this is a very polluted place, no matter what, because of the geography. But there is this good study from the Journal of Urban Economics that shows that it did reduce CO and PM10, like particulate emissions, pretty substantially. And the thing that surprised them actually was that it was not just inside of the zone where it was affected, because air pollution goes outside the zone and it lingers around. So it actually brought down pollution outside of the zone. More than was anticipated. So when I first started studying this, that was one of the sort of the motifs that I'd noticed, was that in some cases the air pollution effects were larger than they had thought. Moving on to the last one, the Gutenberg Congestion Tax. This is another city in Sweden, not as big as Stockholm, a smaller city. This is just like Milan was a bit different insofar as it was targeting air pollution specifically. This is a different case in that they did not have severe congestion, but they really wanted to get money to build this, a few projects, but the big one is this giant rail tunnel under the city of Gutenberg that they're building. So it is exactly the same design as Stockholm, but as you can see, it is a bit more difficult to implement because this is the zone right there, because they're sort of, it's not an archipelago. Geography is not on their side there. But anyway, so as you can see here, this is the vehicle volume. Like I said, it happened in 2012, 2013. So this is sort of the before, the number of vehicles going in per week. And then this is after. So you can see that all the months of the year brings it down. And then this month, this exception is this month of July, which I'm jealous of. Basically, everybody in Sweden apparently just gets July off, so they don't really have that much traffic. So any case, so that was, it succeeded at reducing car traffic. It raised about 100, I think up to $200 million a year now, somewhere in that ballpark, kind of depending on what the Swedish krona is. But it did not display the big travel time reductions that we saw in Stockholm, except on a certain handful of roads that are, when you say interarterials, kind of like they're freeways. because it was not a super congested city sort of to start out with. So you're not going to see big changes in congestion if your city doesn't start out super congested in the first place. So it's sort of an unusual case then. Oh, there's my animation. So anyway, so that is, I hope I didn't talk too quickly, but I didn't want to take up all your time. So that is my presentation. And if anybody has any questions, I'm really not I visit New York City, but I'm not a big expert in it, but I'm happy to especially answer any questions about the cases or things like that. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. This is great. And before we open the floor to questions, can you just expand a little more? I know one of the central issues that that we have concerns about here in terms of the policies that our Traffic Mobility Review Board is going to ultimately determine have to do with exemptions in general. And I know you touched upon it, especially in the Milan case.
Yeah.
But can you just talk a little more about some of the policy implications of exemptions and any considerations that we may want to think about as we work to address the various needs of whether it be our community or Manhattan as a whole, where you have these different groups that may have legitimate reasons to be asking for exemptions or discounts.
Yeah, so in every case, in all of these cases, if we had more time, we could gone through it. There was basically the same kind of debate beforehand about exemptions. So New York's not unusual at all in that regard. And in every case, there were a lot of exemptions. So one of the things, well, it varies how many exemptions there were, but there were always a good number of exemptions. And then one of the things that you observe, if I had more time, is that over time, they tend to get axed because they basically are more potent than were kind of expected. This kind of a motif in the history is that, so for example, like in London, they exempted black cabs, what we just call like an ordinary street hail taxi. And they didn't have the same system where y'all have the congestion charge and things like this. But anyway, so traffic from black cabs increased a lot, and they saw, and the same thing, actually, the same dynamic happened in Stockholm. So they got rid of that exemption, and also in Singapore. So they had the exemption for a while in Singapore, but the influx of traffic was larger than they had anticipated. I can't say that would happen in New York because I know that also they have the license system, the medallion system and such. But also they would also often have exemptions for green vehicles. And then over time, so many people would buy these green vehicles that when they didn't in the exemptions, they would often tighten the definition of green vehicle over time, moving towards just pure battery electric, whereas it would start out with having a broader definition of green vehicle. So it is something that's everywhere. And then over time, they start to go down. The main consideration when you think about them though, because they can be kind of changed later on. I think the main thing to think about though, is that as they proliferate, the system becomes more complicated for simply enforcement reasons. You have to have more types of checks to see if this vehicle is really of this type. So while they're always sort of necessary for passage, they do have a tendency to make the implementation and the setup more complex than it would be otherwise. So I think that's something to think about.
That's very helpful to understand. Alita, did you have anything you want to bring up now before we go to the public? Or
I do, Craig, only because I want to know that we're all talking about the same kind of structure. So I'm wondering if you could explain whether these other congestion pricing zones have the same kind of residential population that we have in New York, or whether they are primarily commercial or manufacturing. I mean, I would guess that Gothenburg in Sweden is probably, if it's a small city, has a mixture, but I don't really know the other cities as well. And If you could just explain that quickly before we go to the public, and thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So you're right. So Stockholm and Gutenberg, they both have a lot of people living like right inside of the zone, inside the zone there. In London, that area that you saw does not have a huge. I mean, there's a lot of people living in there, but it's not a primarily residential area. And actually, for a few years, there were a few years where they actually extended the zone to encompass a large residential area to the west, and then it was not very popular, and it was complicated, so they actually got rid of it. Actually, Boris Johnson, the current prime minister, he was the mayor at the time. He got rid of it. But in Milan, there's a good number of people that live inside of that area. It's not really like a big downtown area. It's more of a historic region. So there's a mix there. So.
Thank you. I have some other questions, but
Sure.
I'll wait till everyone else has an opportunity. Craig, should we go to the public?
Yes, let's go to the public. I first see Leah Hanlon.
Yes.
If you could,
Thank you
okay,
very
you're on mute.
much. And thank you, Professor. That was really interesting. I'm sure it's been explained to you that our community is right outside the congestion area.
Mhm.
And we have a lot of concern that people will drive in from the suburbs or outer boroughs and will all park on our streets, drive around looking for parking, and then either walk or take public transit into Midtown. Has there been any study of how that might have worked in other cities? Did they have any analogous situations?
Yeah. So actually, that was brought to my attention that was a concern, but actually I had not heard that in another city. And so some of the cities that wouldn't really be possible, like Singapore and Stockholm, because of the way that the access points work. But in Gutenberg and in London, I didn't hear about that. At the same time, though, London, which it has like you saw I could go back to the diagram. It's a big ring in the middle of the city. It's not like a water border or anything. They spent a very large amount of money basically retooling lots of infrastructure around the border of the zone, and they kind of thought carefully about impacts on those neighborhoods around the zone. And I don't know everything that they did, and I don't know how much parking was involved with it, but that was something that they did, that they thought about, was enforcement of parking rules and things of that nature. So that the infrastructure changes around the border were definitely a big consideration. I'm just trying to find that little map. A big consideration in London, because these little communities here, they're actually sort of boroughs. They're kind of self-governing to some degree, and so they had a lot of concerns about I think they weren't as concerned about parking, but they were very concerned about basically through traffic, about people avoiding the zone by driving through them, which is one reason they reduced their speed limits and such. But yeah, so I see what your concern is.
Thank you.
We have another member of the public. Would you like to go to him before board members?
Yes, Joe
Joe.
Sullivan, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi,
Go
for
ahead.
Joe?
Mhm.
Okay. First of all, thanks very much. I found that extremely helpful and informative. I wonder, as you've obviously done a lot of work on this, the initial goal, it seems to me, is traffic remediation and sort of calming of traffic in the CBD.
Mhm.
New York, it seems to me that is obviously a goal and has always been a goal. However, from what we get from some of our statewide and local politicians is that it's also congestion pricing is being viewed as a source of revenue for capital projects and such. You mentioned the project in Gutenberg, how that had a enhancement or a capital spend feature to it that was very important. I just wonder, could you just comment for us, as you look at New York, do you view this as similar into the traffic calming goals, which were initially for those other places where we first saw this take hold? Or do you see New York as being a little bit unique in that our mass transit system has been underfunded, potentially some would argue mismanaged fiscally for a number of years, and that this is being used as a revenue generator to take care of shortfalls? Are we unique in that regard?
I think that, well, my knowledge is that this has been proposed over a lot of years. So one of the things that is typical is that something can be proposed over a long time for like a certain reason, and then sometimes like what puts it over the finish line is kind of a crisis that's at the time that it goes over the finish line. But it is very typical for it to be proposed a lot. So for example, the Stockholm one actually was originally proposed in like 1990, and over time it just kind of stayed out there. And sometimes what put it over the finish line was kind of this machinations by the Green Party, but that I think it's kind of actually par for the course. The one in London actually was first proposed in like 1972 or something. And so that's very par for the course. And it's not really that surprising to me that there's sort of this crisis, this financial problem that kind of puts it over the edge. But I don't know if I would really say that it's not motivated by traffic relief, because it's been thought of for a long time as a traffic relief measure, I think even before the financial measure loomed so large. And the designs really haven't changed a massive amount. Like I think that the current zone is somewhat similar to the one from 2007. Maybe it's the same, just sort of south of Central Park. But yeah, so overall I would say not an outlier that much. It's always a mix of these considerations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Valerie?
Okay. I don't see any other members of the public at this point, though. Anyone?
I
do have one now.
Brett Edelstein just raised his or her hand. If we could go to Brett.
Oh, okay, unmute. Hi, I don't know if this is relevant or anyone can answer it, but when it first came out, they said the congestion zone was the business district of Manhattan. And I always found that amazing because it's half of Manhattan. It's not the business district. And the concern, I just wanted to know again, the border of the zone already has standstill traffic on 2nd Avenue. I mean, I go out there every day and it's like, you can't even cross there. In that area at 60th Street, exactly there. So who thought of the actual street of 60th Street, and how was it determined that New York would be divided in half at 60th Street? And why is there, this is called congestion, but I don't think it has anything actually to do with congestion, because in lower, there's a lot of areas in this congestion zone that have actually very little traffic. I'm not sure traffic was taken into consideration in the congestion, pricing. So how did it come about? If anyone knows why it was divided at 60th Street, and I don't understand how they're going to make the traffic less on something like 2nd Avenue by having the congestion pricing. And do they care? I mean, are they only caring about what's happening below 60th Street?
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with how the border was drawn.
I mean, was there a traffic study? I mean, they call it congestion pricing, but it isn't. It's like dividing the city in half, and they're just going to put the cars in one half and the cars not in the other half. I mean, when you talk about London, it seems like they really had a plan, and because it is in the circular grid, it sort of makes sense. But when it's linear like this, where is the traffic? Where is the traffic study that someone came up with to determine where the congestion pricing zone would start and end?
So I may be able to help answer parts of this question. So in regards to the traffic study, there have obviously been lots of traffic studies and analyses performed over the years. As part of the preparation for this, there is supposed to be further traffic analysis that's being done as part of the implementation process. I would surmise that the reason 60th Street was selected was back in the Bloomberg administration proposal. It was mostly, the idea was to toll the bridges and to sort of reallocate the tolling policies of the bridges, not only into New York City, but outside of, inside of Manhattan, but within the outer boroughs as well. And 60th Street, it would have resulted in tolls being put on New York City DOT bridges, meaning the 59th Street Bridge, Williamsburg Bridge, Manhattan Bridge, and Brooklyn Bridge. And obviously that didn't go so far. And traditionally, Midtown has been delineated by 59th Street, 60th Street, south of Central Park, south of the 59th Street Bridge. So once the original proposal fell by the wayside, and as Professor Lee indicated, these plans tend to just keep coming back, it would seem likely that the determination was to use that 60th Street boundary because of the 59th Street Bridge and the Central Business District, and to provide that little carrot for those people who were traveling outside, who were never going to enter the Central Business District, and allowing them to basically be able to then access the FDR Drive to be able to then use the FDR Drive to exit the cities, because the congestion pricing law exempts the FDR Drive and I believe the West Side Highway, West Street as well, to allow people to get around. But once you enter the grid network, that's when you would be charged. So I think that's a lot of the reasoning why 60th Street was chosen.
Right, but I think that it's just interesting to me that they call it congestion pricing when, if you look at traffic studies, there cannot be any more traffic than Second Avenue in the 60s, going all the way back. I mean, it's impossible. So I don't think they really cared about congestion. I think they really cared about making money, having people come in, beyond 60th Street, because it doesn't, logically, you don't even need a traffic study. You just have to go out and look where the traffic is. I mean, Second Avenue is a mess. You cannot move on that street.
I think everyone is very familiar with the challenges that Second Avenue presents.
So so I don't know. It's just frustrating to hear it called congestion pricing when I don't really see how it's going to help anybody above 60th Street.
And I have.
I mean, not even make it worse. I can't imagine Second Avenue worse. It's not possible.
I have the suggestion that the Upper East Side
This is specific.
does
So
things like, but I agree that it shouldn't be considered a business zone, but by calling the Upper East Side
I think she muted herself there.
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
All right, well,
it's disingenuous to call this congestion pricing when half of the city is going to have more congestion.
I think they were supposed to be muted.
And I think I think it's going to happen. It will be 60th Street exactly for what you're saying, but in reality, it's really going to be a lot more congestion on half the island. And I think that's the way it's going to be.
It never will be.
But I feel that by calling the Upper East Side a business zone, that it eliminates
It's the lower East Side. It's the business.
that it eliminates having pop-up events and events for the community by calling it a business zone. If it was promoted more like Lower Manhattan, it seems there could be more of a variety of events for people in the community. That's my concern with a business zone, just to segue.
All right,
Thank
well,
you.
thank
We
you for your
see-
comments.
And we see your concerns. I think in the fall, we'll be able to have more people coming from hopefully New York State or New York City when there are more details about implementing or at least the makeup of the Transit Mobility Review Board. And we'll be able to address some of those concerns better than if we're not meeting in August, but maybe in September. But thank you for expressing them. Is there anyone else from the public who has any questions?
Not from the public, no.
Okay, and before we turn to the board, I'd just like to say, Louis, thank you so much for the detailed, objective presentation about what's going on in other cities. For some reason, I had in my head that there were many more places that had done this and we were not so much of an experiment, but we'll have to see. Okay, then let's go to the board. We'll start with Valerie.
Valerie?
Thanks, Saida.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much for the presentation. I have to say that I didn't find it very surprising. And it's always empowering to know that New Yorkers realize that this is just a scheme for taxation and not a scheme for reducing congestion. But my questions, I really want to talk about the presentation for a little while. When you talked about London, my impression of London in the beginning, and I think you alluded to this, is that they did a massive infrastructure revamp leading up to the implementation of congestion pricing. They spent a huge amount of money to update their infrastructure.
Yeah, so what they did was they put in more bus lanes, and they also bought a couple hundred new buses. They kind of, provided more frequent bus service. And then they also did like street changes, kind of like, more bike lanes, and they changed some traffic. They changed some traffic signal timing to recognize the new sort of the flow of traffic and how it would change so that there would be traffic signal timing. And then they put in some things to make it safer to walk around.
So in relation to that, I think your numbers are from 2007. Your latest numbers in London were from 2007. And I think you indicated that even by 2007, their traffic times were mirroring what their pre-congestion pricing travel times were. So in a very short period of time, any benefit of the congestion pricing was essentially obliterated in that time period. My understanding is, I have a lot of friends who live in London, and the congestion now is just as bad as it was before it was instituted, if not worse, and that Uber and the rest of the vehicles have basically done, now just like it would be here in New York, it's just a tax for going into town. But I want you to answer that, but how would you describe New York in terms of, you talked about Stockholm being an archipelago and easier to do because of all the bridges that were around. And when you look at what they're at least envisioning as the circle or the congestion pricing circle in New York, it doesn't seem to make any sense with any of the few models in the entire world that there are, because the ring around London is essentially the entire city of London. We're talking about a business district in one borough of one of the largest cities in the world. I'm just trying to understand.
Sure. The ring around London is just a small part of London. It's the London Inner Ring Road. So it doesn't. It's not a huge area of London. Like then they have another system actually that goes all the way to the edge of London, which is a low emission zone, but it's sort of, that's another thing. But the zone in London is the Inner Ring Road, and I was saying it's kind of like, that's like where Parliament, Westminster are. It's kind of, if you were to visit London, probably be a lot of your experience of London, but
Okay,
it's
so what
yeah.
would you essentially say is the square footage of that? I mean, what's the
I
radius?
can look up the square kilometers if you want.
I mean, when engineers and people who aren't in the city take a look at this proposed project, I haven't seen a lot written about it in terms of its real viability. I mean, the history of this has been political. I mean, when Mayor Bloomberg originally proposed congestion pricing, it was as a punishment to the cab drivers who were not on board with his original, when he proposed this congestion pricing, and then when they didn't go along this congestion zone, and then when they didn't go along with it, he set out to basically ruin the taxi industry. But what I'm trying to figure out here is, all of these schemes talk about reduction of pollution. Let me ask you this. Sorry, I'm a little bit, in any of these cities, these only 5 cities in the entire world that have this, have you seen the administration at the same time go to close streets to actually increase congestion?
That's what I was saying, is that with the London, so for example, like you said that your friends in London observe more like slower traffic, and that lines up with statistics, and part of that actually is a conscious decision to use the street space for bikes and for buses instead of for cars. So basically, and also they reduced speed limits
right. Okay, we have reduced speed limits, and we have more bike lanes, and we have the express bus lanes. But what we have seen in this city in the last 5 or 6 years is actually the closing of streets to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And what people are experiencing are, forget about COVID, which actually is bringing in more cars now we have more cars in the city now than ever before since COVID. But we have essentially more closed streets and reduced lanes for traffic, which at one presentation in the transportation committee, when we were talking about cars coming over the Queensboro Bridge, and they independently said that the number of cars that had been coming over the bridge has been steadily declining over the last 6 to 7 years. Forget about COVID, that's a little bit different. But the fact that the streets have the square footage of the streets has actually been reduced has resulted in more congestion.
Yeah, so that could happen, because there's fewer lanes for the vehicles to move around. But so basically, what the argument that Transport for London, that manages the streets, the argument that they would make about the effect of the congestion charge is that instead of comparing it sort of present versus pre-congestion charge, they would say, well, what would it be like if all the same things had happened, but we hadn't had the congestion charge? Is basically what they say. And they say, well, if we'd had all these new for hire vehicles, and we'd also taken space for the buses and reduced the speed limits and such, they would say, well, then congestion pricing would be substantially worse. So that's kind of the baseline that they kind of look at, as what would things be like if we hadn't done it, rather than how are things now versus 20 years ago. So basically your congestion is not just going to be a result. The last thing I'll say is that your congestion is not just going to be a result and entirely due to whether or not you do this scheme. Obviously, congestion depends on the whole package of all the different transportation policies that the city elects to pursue and raise, big and small. Yeah.
And in these cities, last question, in these cities where there is congestion pricing, how often is the congestion pricing charge increased?
Not very often. So, well, I would say in Singapore, it goes up and down because, like I said, they just basically change it every 3 months on every road. They have those little gantries, those little metal McDonald's arches that go over the road. Those are set to just automatically increase a little bit if traffic's too slow, and decrease a little bit if it's too fast. in the other ones, Stockholm, it's been increased once since 2006. Gutenberg, it's been increased once since 2013. In Milan, they haven't changed it since 2012 when they switched over to the new system. And then the other case I didn't mention.
One last question, and this was actually something that Lori brought up in another meeting, so I'm stealing some of her thoughts here. When you try to look at congestion pricing and things like that in Europe, the size of the cars are much smaller, the size of the lorries are much smaller, the size of the buses are much smaller. Do you think that that has an impact on the success of congestion pricing?
I don't think so, because, like, you know, if you think about it, like if your trucks are even larger and if your vehicles are even larger, if you reduce them, it would actually have a bigger impact.
Well, why would you think that? Why would you think that the truck traffic would reduce when there's congestion pricing? Wouldn't just the price of goods go up?
Well, so just I should say regular vehicles. The regular vehicles, you're correct. They have much smaller regular vehicles than we do in the United States, just cars and crossovers and such. But my intuition is it probably doesn't have a big impact, the size of the vehicle. That would probably just change sort of their baseline of what congestion is for a given. But if you talk about sort of the derivative of that, how much does congestion change when you reduce traffic? I don't think that having smaller vehicles would probably give you less congestion, but the reduction, it wouldn't make the reduction more potent. I actually think it would probably make it a little bit less potent because they can fit more vehicles in a given block, and they don't have, with smaller vehicles, you would have less blocking the box and things of that nature. But I bet that it's not a giant factor.
I just would like to ask a clarifying question before we move on to Marco. I'm not understanding something about London's thinking. If they're comparing it to what it is now, and they're saying if we didn't have congestion pricing, it would be worse. But those very features of bus lanes and bike lanes and fewer lanes for cars are precisely the result of their decision of either the result of congestion pricing or of their decision to have congestion pricing. They decided as a result, it all worked together, right? They decided to have the congestion pricing, and at the same time, they decided to reduce the number of lanes available for cars, to put in bus lanes, to put in bike lanes. So I'm not understanding how they could say that it would be worse if they didn't have it, because those things exist precisely because they do have it, unless I'm missing something.
There's a sense, I think, it depends on what the causation is, but there's a sense in which it probably is true to some degree that they did those things because they had the congestion pricing, right? But if we were to just talk about, does the fact of tolling discourage traffic? I think that's the point that they're making. But in a very broader sense, maybe you could say that, it's all part of a large package. And then you could argue that the package would not have come through if it wasn't for it. But I think at that point, I feel a little bit beyond my specialty, because I'm not an expert in the London politics. I've read about the history of what did happen, but I don't know what would have happened. But I do know that they did have a general kind of agenda where they in general wanted to reduce vehicles going through central London in a lot of ways. So I kind of think maybe if they hadn't done it, they would have done to some degree some of the other things. They really prioritized buses a lot, and that was one of the things that Ken Livingstone, the mayor of London, had campaigned on, was this big bus reform and everything. So it was kind of a part of a large agenda, as you know. And I don't really know how much of the agenda would have happened with or without. But yeah, they were making it it was a big push.
Yeah, I'm not trying to hold you accountable. I just thought that maybe I was missing something in the explanation of it, but I appreciate your statement about that. So then if we could turn to Marco.
We do have a member of the public on the phone. I'm going to ask that you press *6 to unmute and identify yourself, because.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. Good evening. I'm so sorry to push. I got my phone went anyway. Technical issue. There is something nobody is talking about at all. if you want to take care of air pollution and get the subway ridership back up again and solve all these problems, it's called municipal parking lots out in the outer boroughs near the entrances to subway stops. So people can drive to the municipal parking lot, park there for $10 a day. The city makes gobs and gobs of money. They jump on the subway and they come into Manhattan, and you've got massive amounts of people on the subways. You don't have the traffic anymore, because the reason everybody drives in from Queens, and I know this from David Weprin's offices, where everybody's complaining about congestion pricing, is that they have to drive in because they can't get to the subway lines because there's no bus to take them in bad weather, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, that would be the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens and the outer boroughs. That would solve a massive problem. Nobody talks about this stuff, okay? And I don't know why. And across the street from Bloomingdale's is a gigantic lot that is empty. Imagine cars coming off the 59th Street Bridge, zipping into the municipal parking lot all day, and then getting on the 59th Street subway. This is all looking at our little tiny landmarked area in the world. It's this wonderful little community, which actually the Upper East Side, the cars are going to come off the bridge and go up into this neighborhood, and nobody's going to be able to stop them. Okay. They're going to be circulating around, taking all the parking. It's going to be a nightmare. And anybody thinks it isn't going to be, is like, you don't know New Yorkers. Okay. And you actually have to live here to want to save this place. So I keep fighting about this. The other thing is the gentleman that has been talking about all these congestion pricing areas in different cities, if he could study the 59th Street Bridge and know that coming off the bridge, you can get onto 60th Street and go, if they make the price line below 57th Street, which I said in the last meeting with Senator Kruger, you can go across to the town to the west side to go park in west side garages and then jump on a subway and then come back on 59th Street or 58th Street to get back on the bridge again. And 57th Street actually will take you to the upper level, but you have to know all this stuff. You have to be somebody who lives here. So I'm not hearing any real details. And what I'm really afraid of is the people that they're going to put on these committees will not come from this neighborhood, will not listen to anything anybody has to say, and they're just going to ram it down our throats, and it's going to cost money to go below 60th Street. That's all. And they'll make lots of money, maybe, or maybe not. And so, I'm really sorry, but, all these ideas for the other cities do not have 8 million people living in them, right? So,
Would you just identify?
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry. My name's Evelyn David.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Yeah, I zipped on. Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we're ready for Marco. Saida, can you please unmute Marco?
Confirm unmuting.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Saida. Thank you, Craig. Professor, I think, thank you so much. It means you almost clarify many misunderstanding and many ways to express those cities as an example for New York City. I think you did a great job. I'm very grateful for that. And I think, I don't know what more to say, what you did. And it's true, if you travel from Roosevelt Island to Manhattan, it's beautiful. If you do it the sunset, it's even gorgeous. I love to do these trips constantly, but it's too long, but it's beautiful. Definitely, I agree with you. The issue right here, what I found is we try to compare apples with potatoes. That's what it is, with all respect. It's nothing against you, Professor. You did very well. Let me explain. We're talking about high density city. You see, I don't know if you see the building huge behind me. That is a potential building in the Upper East Side. And that is the size normally that you find in that district, especially in the business district. And so you compare high densities with low densities. You compare pollution in New York City versus pollution in Milan. New York City, the origin of the pollution in New York City, especially, is coming from the buildings. 70% of the CO2 or the greenhouse are coming from buildings. So New York City, the biggest problems, the pollutants are the buildings, not the traffic. So we put traffic to with the bicycles, but the bicycles right here in New York City is the idea is to do exercise, and they immediately put electrical systems. So they fit the whole process, the whole idea to do exercise. You compare orthogonal cities versus circular cities. That's what it is. It is completely, absolutely different. And you don't. I think it's out of your scope of analysis is the type of the income that people live in these communities. I think Alida said the discussion in that direction. Our city or our communities, we would like to have an equitable cities, an equitable neighborhood where everybody have an opportunity, the wealthy, the middle income, and the low income house. And that is where we have a lot of affordable housing. And affordable housing, the biggest problem is every year there is a fight, there is a war almost between those residents that they said no more increase in the income and the rent because we can't afford. It's too much money. In reality, it's true, but if you compare with the landlord, it's also true. Now, the only the match is money, taxes. Taxes go directly to not to the high income, because the high income can afford to resolve this problem. The problem is the impact economical probably from the middle down to the low income families. To give an example, maybe to understand the magnitude of the problems in our community, is I have to give you in the Upper East Side some statistics. In approximately we have 147,000 households in our community, from which almost 50% are co-op owners and condo owners and mansion owners. And the other half, approximately, is, let's go see, maybe 70,000 households. Those 70,000 households, which basically are rental market. And the rental market, 52%, they are paying more than 30% of their income. And at 23%, they pay more than 50% of their income. So that means if you put more taxes, those people, the landlord is going to say, well, you want me to repair, now I'm going to charge more. If you want to buy a food outside, right now, you go to the supermarket, whatever you buy it in $60 now, you got to pay $90 or $100. So the impact for those families that pay 50% of their income towards to the rent, it will be the decision either become homeless and pay the rent or starving. So that is what I'm standing against this proposal that was approved. And I think it's wrong. And always I'm going to keep fighting for that. And also, I think one of the ladies that I don't like personally myself, I think is a congresswoman from Brooklyn and Staten Island, Nicole, I don't know the last name. She's asking for a study of economic impact in the congestion pricing, because I think it's wrong what are they doing. Again, Professor, you did beautiful. You clarify a lot of things for me, because I have been listening many people that come and say, oh, London do this way, and oh, the other city that's beautiful, the other city. No, in reality, what it is we compare different situations, different problems. Yes, we need to repair our transit system. Yes, we need to repair the trains. Yes, all of this, we need that, but it has to be in another way. We can create different taxes for that part. Yes, we have a problem of traffic too. Yes, no doubt. But why the issue is of the traffic? People are not crazy to come to the center of Manhattan. They are coming with one purpose, and the purpose they're coming is jobs. Jobs. That is what it is. Job is the problem. I'm not saying that job is bad. Be careful. I'm saying is you allow, or the government allows to have too many jobs concentrated in one specific area, and people have to travel because they have to do it. And those people, regardless if you increase whatever amount of money, they will still coming because they're coming because of job or because of business. And the idea is decentralize those business, and the traffic will move away of that. And that's, I think, is the solution. Is we need a more quality analysis of the zoning resolution, which is, I believe, that is what I think the comprehensive plan is one of the great ideas, because then we want to discuss this issue. Now, with respect with the technical issue, I think is your idea that presented to us, I think is extraordinary. I think we're gonna learn from that. We're gonna apply for them in most of the cases. But the bottom line right here, the congestion pricing is wrong, completely wrong, because they don't have what are they doing. And the only thing they said, oh, low income housing, middle income housing. No, it's not all. The problem is affect everybody, except especially in money, and that create a disparity of cities. And we can create poor cities and rich cities, poor neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods. I think that is wrong. And thank you so much, Professor, for your presentation was great. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Marco. Next we have Sharon.
Thank you, Louis, for the presentation. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Thank you, Saida. Thank you, Louis, for the presentation, and also Alita and Craig. Really appreciate your leadership on this. It was a good presentation to hear. I have a couple of questions, Louis. The first is, all things being equal, overall, do you think that tolling discourages automobile traffic?
Wait, the Professor Lee is muted. Saida, can you unmute him?
Confirm unmuting. Go ahead.
I couldn't unmute myself until this. Okay, so
I appreciate the visual. That was very helpful.
I was like, well, I couldn't use a chat, and I was like, oh, well, I got to think mechanically. Okay, do I think it reduces traffic? Yes. So it will, when you I just did this review, kind of looking at a bit more of how this kind of thing works, and I have kind of this opinion that sometimes what matters actually even more than how much you charge. Sometimes it's the fact of charging, because oftentimes you're not really. So one of the things I've noticed in talking to people about tolling is that most people think of the typical driver, and the typical driver cannot change what they do. Maybe the most representative driver, right? The typical driver has to do whatever they're doing. Sometimes actually their commute is horrible and they wish they didn't have to do it, but they do it because they have to. But for traffic, oftentimes to get results, you don't have to get a reduction of 50% of people doing something. Oftentimes traffic becomes very bad if you have a road that's mildly congested and you increase the number of people on it by sometimes just 10% or something. It becomes extremely congested at that point. So oftentimes for traffic, you really just need to change a fraction, right? So it's the typical driver winds up doing what they will do no matter what. They just pay money to do it. The way that it affects traffic is that there's a certain percent, it could be 10, 20, 30% of people in the extreme case that change their behavior. So that's kind of how it works. And so the many before and after studies and surveys and such show that there's when you implement a toll, there's going to be some fraction of people that do something different. And they have a lot of margins along which they adapt. A few people switch to transit. A few people travel at different times of day. A few people change where they're going to avoid the tolling place, change their route, something. So there's a lot of margins by which people adapt. Most people don't adapt, and then some fraction do adapt. They do something different, and that's kind of where the reduction comes from. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I understand. That makes total sense. You don't have to have a significant reduction. I mean, even a small reduction will have a significant impact.
Yeah.
I think that would be the long and the short of it.
Yeah.
My second question is, you talked about exemptions, for example, for Black cars. And at one point, Black cars were exempted, and then they were no longer exempted. Do you have any information about exemptions for residents?
So in London, so this is one of the things is in London, they have an exemption, what they call a discount for residents. And I believe the discount makes it so it's very cheap, or it might be free if you register for it. So that's one place that has it. And then Milan has the same thing, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah. So they have that in London.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah, now that I remember, I think you did mention that.
Yeah.
Now, regarding the congestion in London, with the increase in bike lanes and in bus lanes,
yeah,
and also the overall redesign of the street structure, and essentially, as you said, taking space away from private cars and moving it over to either bike lanes or busways. So what is happening is that there are cars being squeezed into a smaller space. That's a good
metaphor. I think that's a good metaphor. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Because we're not seeing the same amount of cars in the same amount of space.
Right.
It's like
less cars and less space. Yeah.
Yeah, less cars and less space. I think moving forward, that's how we should understand it. And with Gutenberg and Milan, I think in terms of the presentations, especially with respect to New York, they might be a tad bit outliers.
They're much smaller, yeah.
Well, I mean, and I'm not really focusing on the size as much as the rationale.
Oh, yeah.
I love Gutenberg because you said they just, it was just a reason to raise funds, and
yeah.
They were very clear about that up front. I think that might be a nice place to live, by the way. Just for that reason.
I've never been there.
Just for that reason alone, they're very clear about their intentions.
Yeah.
And as well as Milan, they're very clear about the fact that it's about pollution.
Yeah.
So I see those more as outliers. But then you have Singapore, you have Stockholm, and you have London. At the end of the day, you still, and assuming that their rationale or their stated rationale was to reduce cars, they did reduce cars.
Yeah.
So they achieved their objectives.
Yeah.
Okay. One other question about speeding, or because you mentioned a couple of times that in those zones, speeds were reduced.
Yeah, in London. Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't clear if there was an increase of speeding cars or not.
I don't know.
It appears,
yeah.
I'm sorry, let me rephrase my question. I thought I heard you say that when the speeds were reduced, there was subsequent speeding. So I'm wondering if I heard you correctly.
Sorry, yeah, I was probably unclear. No, I didn't read about a like a increase in like speed violations. I didn't, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I didn't mean to impose that.
Okay, so in all three of those areas, they reduced the speeds in those zones?
In London, I know they reduced speed limits on a lot of the local streets around there. Yeah, I didn't read about that happening in the other cities. It may have happened, but I read Transport for London said that one of the reasons that the travel times have gone up is that they've reduced many of the speed limits on the neighborhood streets and such. So that was the main one, is the one in London.
Okay, and thank you so much again, Louis, for the presentation. Really appreciate you spending the time with us this evening.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's really good for me because I do all this research and it's just, me in an office. So it's nice to actually talk to people about it.
And we'll look for you again on Roosevelt Island.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely going to be back. I just told my brother all about it, and then he's going this weekend. So yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Sharon. Next we have Rit.
Confirm unmuting.
Sorry, everybody. Thanks, Craig and Louis. I want to echo everybody's congratulations. That was a really nice and concise summary of a couple of cities. Got a couple of observations in response to some of the comments that people have made, and then I actually do have one question for you, Professor. A couple of things that I've heard. One, I think a number of people have made observations that miss the fact that in all of the cities, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, Professor, but in all of the cities that have done a zone-based congestion charge, the surrounding neighborhoods have tended to experience, and you cited particularly, I think Milan, have experienced significant benefits, both in terms of air quality and in reduction of traffic, for the straightforward reason that most of the cars heading through those neighborhoods are not actually going to those neighborhoods. They are going to the central business district that is the tolled zone. Is that correct?
So that's accurate. So the travel times and the traffic flow in all the other cities, I didn't really want to comment on the New York case being identical because I don't know that much about the geography exactly of this network. But in the other cases, there was a lot of fall in traffic on the arterials coming into the zone, the routes that people use for traveling through. The routes that are coming into the zone, obviously, they experience traffic reductions because cars just don't magically appear at the border of the zone. They travel there through the other neighborhoods. I don't know what the traffic flow patterns are in Manhattan exactly, but that was, you're exactly right. That was observed in all those cities.
So for our district, for our community ward on the Upper East Side and Roosevelt Island, we should expect rationally to see a reduction in the number of cars driving through from north of 96th Street to south of 59th Street, as well as a reduction in the number of cars coming over the Queensboro Bridge and therefore polluting the air directly above Roosevelt Island. So that's one. I think several people have commented on the idea that there's congestion outside of the congestion zone. Yeah. The zone is not where the congestion is. The zone is where the cluster of destinations of trips are that have a transit alternative. And I think that's the really important point. And by that, a zone starting at 60th Street will have a tremendously beneficial impact on the traffic conditions on the Upper East Side. Make a second observation in response to something somebody said. And Marco, you made a comment which I would actually urge you to reinterpret. You said that buildings are responsible for 70% of the pollution. That's a statistic that I came up with as a result of the analysis that I did when I worked for Mayor Bloomberg at City Hall. And that is true with respect to carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide, which causes climate change in New York City, is largely produced by the energy we consume in buildings. When it comes to air pollution, the kind of pollution that affects our lungs, affects our heart, and causes direct health problems for the people who breathe it, in fact, traffic is still the largest source. Now, we had one aspect of that in buildings, which was dirty heating oil, number 6 heating oil, which in fact the Bloomberg administration banned. And so that eliminated that as a major source of pollution. Now in New York City, the bulk of our air pollution actually comes from vehicles in the form of sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and in fact, something we rarely appreciate, which is tire dust. And actually the simple friction of tires on asphalt is an increasingly large percentage of the particulate matter that we're breathing in. If you wipe the black soot off of your windowsill, if you leave the window open and you're on a major thoroughfare, a surprising amount of that you wipe up is actually going to be pulverized rubber from the tires. So it does stand to reason that reducing traffic, reducing the number of car trips through our neighborhood will have a significant impact on the air quality in our neighborhood. And frankly, a year ago when we were in lockdown and there wasn't much traffic and the skies were clearer, we saw that. Now we won't get all of that way, of course, with the charges that we're looking towards when congestion pricing is implemented, but we will have that air quality benefit. And so this is not a misapplied policy towards the goal of air pollution. That's a misconception because of the difference between climate change pollutants, carbon dioxide, which come primarily from buildings, versus health pollutants, which come primarily from vehicles. And then I guess the question, the final comment I'll make, and Professor, tell me, you highlighted these several cities. My understanding, though, is that there are a number of other cities that have things that they don't call them congestion pricing, but they are in fact pretty similar. Rome has a ZTL, I believe, that's effectively a congestion charge. There are a couple of cities, in fact, in Italy that do have similar things for their historic centers. I feel like even Dublin may have something akin. And then there are, of course, a whole slew of cities, primarily in Latin America, that have ones that ration access to the downtown based on license plates. So I guess my comment, and then I'll turn it back over to you, but my observation is that while the specific mechanism that we're imagining here has only, I'd say it is more than 5, but call it 10 or 12 cities around the world, there's actually at least twice that number that have alternative approaches to rationing who gets to drive into the central business district.
Yeah. So there are a lot of cities that have on-off days and such. Like Jakarta has a lot of cities in Latin America and Central America, Mexico, and then they have the ZTLs that are operated. They have a similar effect. They're not exactly operated in the same way. Like they have that's a lot about limiting. That's a bit more like rationing in some ways, and they're not kind of designed to do exactly the same things. But I think that what they all have in common, I suppose, is what you're already like pointing out, which is that they result in fewer vehicles coming in, and so the effects should be similar. And my understanding is that they are kind of similar effects.
All right, thank you, Rick, for those comments. Next, we have Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you, Louis. It was very enlightening. Actually, the cities that you did show, with the exception of Milan, none of them really compare to New York. Even in London, and I too have a lot of friends there, And of course, it's anecdotal, but they do not think that this was a successful program. Also, going into the business district of London, that's also a historic district. It's also their landmark district. They don't permit new building or anything in that district. And so they don't have to deal with the construction barriers, because that's an old area too. So there are very narrow streets, and they don't deal with any of those obstructions that we deal with here on a regular basis. I also just want to address a couple of things. Just this came up that Rich just mentioned, that in fact, if the cars are fewer going through a neighborhood into the congestion price district, then therefore there will be less traffic in the adjoining neighborhoods. That would be a true statement if those cars coming to the congestion district did not choose to stop before that district, park in our neighborhood, and then take alternative public transportation into the district. So I think that needs to be clarified, because if that's the case, which we are sensing will most likely be the case, because people are trying to avoid the fee, that they will be stopping in our area. So that's another thing. You want to talk about the oil, the number 6 oil. Yes, it's true that it reduced the pollution from the higher density oil. However, you need to use twice as much of that oil to get the same heating. So I'm not so sure what kind of a thing that is. The thing that troubles me about this whole program, as I see it, is that it was mainly a political decision from the get-go. And it took a very long time. It's gone through a lot of machinations. Even to this day, and this is going on, so how many years, if it's since the Bloomberg administration, to this day, there is not one elected official that can tell you the details of this plan. They don't know how much it'll cost. They don't know how they're going to treat the outer boroughs. They don't know what they're doing with the bridges. They don't know what they're doing with the drive. We have questioned many people, and it's many, many, many years now. Nobody has given us the details. So if we had to do a vote on congestion pricing, at all times, we were voting either for the concept or against the concept. We never ever saw the details. Now, this congestion pricing will not deter commercial business from going into the zone. Amazon is not stopping their trucks from going into the zone. Fresh Direct isn't. The supermarket deliveries, all those truckers that are necessary for business will go into the zone. They will pay the price. And then guess who they're going to pass the cost on to? All of those costs that will be generated from having such a zone will be passed on to the consumer. Will it affect the richest consumer? No. It's going to affect disproportionately people at the lower ends of the earning spectrum. And so this is going to cause a very big financial burden to a good portion of the population of New York City. Also, what we're seeing happening is programs that were instituted during the pandemic for the benefit of businesses and others are now being proposed to be permanent. There's a discrepancy in the city legislature and in the state legislature as to what that will be. The dining program, the outdoor dining, is an example of that. The city voted to make it permanent. The state said only for the next year, and then they look at it again. To me, that's much more rational to carry these businesses through the pandemic and then reevaluate, because to have every street additionally narrowed by all of these uncontrolled construction entities, to me is very hazardous and very difficult. So that's going to add to it. In London, you talk about closing streets. They did close. They closed Oxford streets. It's only open to black cars and buses, and it's mainly for pedestrians. So there's a lot of things that's going to have to happen here to make this happen. But I think if you look at it as an overall for who it benefits, who it punishes, I think overall for the population, it's going to be detrimental. And to the extent that I really think it was politically introduced, Bloomberg in particular was very anti-automobile, just really wanted to eliminate. He started the whole, biking and the bike lanes and all that, which here has narrowed every single street in this city. It's narrowed Broadway. And that's our big cash cow, is the Broadway Theater District. The traffic to get down to theater is impossible, whether you're in your private car, a car for hire, a taxi, a bus, whatever you are. And a good percentage of our population, especially the theater going population, are elderly, and it is not convenient or easy for them to use our subways at all hours of the day and night or ever. So my concern, I have a lot of concerns about congestion pricing. I don't think any of the cities that you highlighted really compares to New York. Even London is a smaller scale. I've been to Milan, I've been to Rome. Rome is probably comparable, but I don't know that their residential districts are as close to their congestion pricing districts. I don't know where they're located. The same with Milan, but Milan admittedly did it for pollution reasons. Last, I'll say this. I think the MTA is pretty well known for very poorly managing their money. And I think this is a very inefficient way of encouraging the MTA to be more careful and more prudent and more thoughtful about how they manage their money, how they do improvements, and also the big monies that are coming from Washington being infused into the MTA should help a lot with what they have to do. But they really have to go back to the drawing board and be more careful about it. And I just don't expect congestion pricing to bail them out. And I expect it to be a big burden on the rest of the population. Thank you for listening.
Can I ask you a question about the parking?
Sure.
I want to be clear. I'm just interested. The concern is the possibility that somebody drives into the neighborhood, parks on just north of the boundary, parks their car, and then gets on like a bus and rides the rest of the way, or something of that nature.
Correct, because that if a person has to come to work, a traveling salesman who needs his car, there are people who need their cars for business, whatever. And if they're just working people and the pricing in the congestion zone is high, they are, of course, going to look for street parking in the neighborhood that is north or east or west of that border. So they're not passing through. They're going to stop and stay. What exacerbates this is that we don't have garages enough. And the reason for that is years ago, city planning reduced the mandate that every building over a certain size had to have parking inside the building. So we used to typically build buildings that had parking lots inside. Since that law, the cost of parking inside a parking lot is actually prohibitive. You can pay as much as $50 a night. It's very costly on a basis where a commuter would have to deal with that. So we have very few of those lots. Those that can afford to use them will use them, but mainly others will come in and ride around and circle through our community looking for a parking spot that with a proximity as best as they can to them, either walking into the zone if their destination is nearby or taking public transit into the zone. The passing through will not be the issue. It's the stopping and staying that's going to be the issue. And that's going to be the main issue.
So so there's a lot of on-street parking there. So
correct.
So the streets, but there's not like control of the park. There's not like
No.
meters. There's not meters or
There are meters on, that's correct. There are meters
Okay.
on some street. They're limited. They're mainly 1 hour, some are 2 hours, which of course is not enough for a whole day. The lady who mentioned municipal parking lots in the outer boroughs, that's a fabulous idea. And she's quite right. Nobody is talking about it and everybody should be talking about it. That would be a good solution. People, an affordable way to park and then take public transportation in. At the moment, we don't have anything like that. Our parking laws in Manhattan consist of commercial parking, usually with paid 3-hour limits, and that's for trucks, etc. And our parking for people who are shopping or residents or whatever is either our alternate side of the street parking, which changes based on sanitation, the days that they're cleaning the streets, and on the meters. And even those spots have been markedly reduced because of the outdoor dining. And now restaurants along the avenues primarily, although on some side streets, on many side streets actually, but they have now been permitted to build outdoor dining structures in those parking areas. So all that has been significantly reduced, plus the streets have been additionally narrowed because of that. Some streets have been closed in other areas of the city. So there's a lot to think about here. New York is atypical and very large. I mean, and our boroughs, like Brooklyn's got what, 5 million or more people. I mean, and Manhattan, 8 million people, and our business hubs for certain businesses are right here in New York. There's a lot of different ways to solve this. So if they're claiming that it's to finance upgrades of the MTA, I suggest there are better ways. And I think because the costs of this are going to be passed on to the consumer on the low earning level, I think it's going to be overall quite damaging. I think it's going to be very expensive, and that coupled with our recent inflation, and which seems to be on the climb, is not going to help anybody. So coupled with the fact we have no details. We don't even know what we're talking about here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle.
Your overview was extremely helpful to me because
Yeah.
not only highlighted how it was implemented, but for me, it further highlighted the difference between New York and some other cities. So for me, it was very enlightening. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank
All
you,
right,
Michelle.
Next we have Billy.
Confirm a meeting.
Great. Thank you, Professor, for joining us. I thought the presentation was terrific. And while you were speaking, I started looking through your paper on this, which so far is also excellent. And I do have a question stemming from that in just a minute. But a comment before my questions. I'm not persuaded that New York is all that unique or all that different from other large cities, particularly on this issue. And if anything, it seems to me that the differences, cut in both directions. One difference being that New York has extraordinary density of public transit, particularly in Manhattan, where this would be implemented. And we have 24/7 public transit, one of the few cities in the world with such a system. I did want to ask just maybe 2 or 3 questions. One is touching on your paper. I was looking through it to look at some of the exemptions that other cities have embraced. And regarding exemptions for people with disabilities or people going to and from health facilities, it looks like London and Stockholm have exemptions for people with disabilities, and London also has an exemption potentially for people who are going to and from hospitals and other health facilities. Can you just talk a little bit about how that exemption has worked in those cities? Is it a pretty narrow exemption, and is it something that people have to apply for, say, after they've been charged at the hospital, or is it based on the type of vehicle they're in?
So the way it works in London is that, so there's this type of license plate that they have in the UK, and I believe they have, and it's like a blue badge license plate that is like basically like having a disability placard in your car, but it's like a license plate so they can identify it. And so but I believe administratively what you have to do is you have to kind of like log on to the system and say like, I'm going to be, I'm exempt from this and such. And then with the hospital, with the medical visits thing, if you go to an NHS, a National Health Service facility in there, you can, it's like you go on the website and you can say, I should be exempt. And, I went there and I'm not exactly sure how they communicate the information. It's all the government. So I kind of hope that it just kind of goes from one place to another, but they do have those exemptions, and you're right about that. Yeah. In London. Yeah. But the enforcement, I think, is easier because of this license plate that they have.
Great. That's very helpful. To the point about the potential regressivity of congestion pricing, the Community Service Society here in New York studied this, found that of outer borough residents who are working poor, only 2% drive into Manhattan for work. Have you looked at, though, whether congestion pricing played out in a regressive way in the cities you studied? And did the exemptions or potential rebates for those at a certain income threshold, did those work successfully? Is there anything that we can look at here in New York as a model?
None of the other ones have an exemption for income thresholds. They don't have it. So I don't think there's a model for it. So that's not something that exists that I could compare to. I'm not sure how that would work. One of the things that I always like bring up the administration, because sometimes one of the things that I noticed is that when I was studying the history, is that there's kind of like something that makes sense when you say it in almost like in a conversational way, but then when you have to formulate it as a policy and be specific about it, it becomes somewhat more complex in terms of. I'll just give you this example. I'm not saying it's a bad idea to have an income threshold or something, but imagine that there was a threshold set at, let's say, $70,000. Does that mean that somebody makes $69,900 gets it, and somebody that makes $70,001 doesn't get it? Because these things sometimes become more complex when they're implemented. This is the only thing I'll say about it. It's more of a political decision, but I hope that people think about that, and they don't end up having these kind of weird cliffs or having some complicated administration where you have to report your income all the time or something like that.
Yeah, and for the rest of the task force, the legislation that you sort of set up the whole scheme has, from what I've read, created exemptions for people with disabilities and for people making 60,000 or less. I think those people have to live within the congestion zone, is my understanding. But obviously, the Transportation Mobility Review Board can create new exemptions, at least is my understanding of it. So I guess that's what we know so far, but there's obviously a lot more that we don't know. And then I guess the last thing I want to talk about is unintended consequences. So there is a worry that with a congestion zone at 60th Street, let's say you live on 61st Street, but your parking garage is on 59th Street, just for sake of argument, that you would have to, incur that fee, every day when you park your car. And to bring it into something topical, the Democratic nominee for mayor, Eric Adams, was asked about congestion pricing and said there should be distinction between people who drive in for luxury and people who drive in for necessity. And how am I going to distinguish? I'm going to use technology. Now, a lot of us were kind of unsatisfied with that answer. It feels like just technology will magically solve this. But is there a technology in any of these cities that you think could work to make those kind of narrow distinctions between someone who's simply circling a block to get to their parking garage and really shouldn't incur the fee, or someone who, for example, is trying to avoid the congestion zone, but because traffic was redirected by the police, they had to go into the zone? Is there anything that you know of that could be contemplated?
I think with the garage example, it seems like if there were a residence exemption, then you would probably, if your apartment building has a garage over there, then you would probably be able to get that. In London, the residence exemption, if I recall correctly, is not just for inside the zone. It's for it goes a little ways outside the zone too. So that's how they did it, because they didn't want to have that kind of sharp boundary of the cases that you're naming, which seems sensible to me. As far as like trip purpose, that I think that would require like GPS. I mean, if you want to know, like in all these zones, we don't really see we don't really see your trip. It's like going to Disney World or something, or not a county fair or something. Like you go inside and then you can go around on the rides or something, but we just see that you go inside. We don't exactly track you. So I bet that wouldn't be very popular. So I don't know.
Or Disney World tracks you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm always being tracked by somebody, but anyway, but with the trip purposes though, like I gave the example of the visits to the hospital. That's a bit easier because there's a record of you going to this government facility, so it can be rebated or canceled or, some for a particular trip. But it's like, if you want to expand it to like people that need to go to a certain grocery store or something, I do think it gets kind of complex about having a lot of different definitions of what counts as necessary or need. Whereas like for hospital visit, disability, we already have clearly defined facts of like, you have the placard or or you're going to the hospital or something. But if you get down to just an intuitive sense of what counts as necessary and unnecessary, I think that can kind of become complex to administer.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. This was really, really helpful, and especially the point about what London's done with expanding the zone to as it applies to the residence exemption. I think that's something we should look into as a task force.
Yeah.
Yes. Great. Thank
Billy.
you.
Craig, before we go back to people from the board who've already had.
Well, I was just going to say Professor Lee needs to go in a minute, but I've been communicating with him and made sure that he saves time for your questions.
Thank you so much, Craig. I just have really one question, and it's about how the taxis work in London or any of the cities. In London, which is what they're talking about here, which is one fee a day, how do the taxis allocated? And is there a reduction in the taxis because the Ubers, the Lyfts, those kinds of services have increased? And have they increased? Are they treated any differently in the zone than taxis are? And why have they increased to such a great degree? And is that if it's related to congestion pricing, obviously not economics, but just how do taxis allocate the fare to passengers all day long? Do you know?
So basically, that's a good question. So part of it is, the competition between the Ubers and such. So essentially the reason that the Ubers increased is just because Uber happened during this time period. So they sort of got regulatory approval and they came in but as far as allocating it, I think they don't it's just kind of like I would say that it's probably just kind of like the market, because a taxi fare in London is pretty large in a lot of cases, So if they do a few fares a day, it's like £11.50 spread over a lot of trips on a day. It probably just kind of by the market, but I haven't seen a study about the impact on the price, how the price changed. But as far as the Ubers becoming covered, it was part of this big kind of court battle that drew out and got very complicated, because for hire vehicles are treated very differently than taxis, than black cabs there. And so there was this big thing about, for a while, I think they were both exempt, and then Uber was charged, had to pay it, but then the black cabs didn't. And now I think recently the black cabs have to pay it as of maybe last year or the year before. And then there's another scheme that I didn't really talk about because it's not exactly very similar, but it's this low emission zone that's more for diesel cars that spreads all over London. So yeah, I think that the black cabs were much more impacted by the arrival of the TNCs than the congestion charge, because their revenues are pretty large compared to the daily charge. They don't have to pay each trip. So that actually makes y'all's zone pretty different than London's, in the sense that y'all have this, as part of the same zone, or actually extending a little bit further north, I believe, there's this per ride charge, right?
No, I think they're talking about only charging the fee once a day, but we're so used to, and we have a real problem because they now assess a taxi fee, a
Yeah,
congestion
that's the one I'm talking about.
below
Yeah.
96th Street, yes, for
Yeah.
every fare. We're
Yeah.
so used to, if you look at the basic fare for a taxi, that's not that bad, but when you tack on $1 here and $3 extra for this, it really adds up. And so my thinking was that they would find some way for the government to require allocation, or the cab drivers would. But if you're saying the fee is just absorbed by what the fares are, they don't have any excess allocation or
Yeah, they might have increased the regulated fare when they did it. I didn't read about that, but it does. Are they talking about exempting the cabs from it? Because the cabs already have that, the one that came in, was it January 2020? Is that when it came in?
Yeah, and that's been a source of contention since it's come in, because it really discriminates for people in this neighborhood. But that's another, or people below 96th Street, that's another discussion. And they, from what I understand from Senator Krueger last time, is that they're not talking about eliminating that particular fee. So it's a lot.
So when they eliminated the exemption there in Stockholm, it's a little bit different because it's kind of each time you cross the boundary. So that it was kind of like people were able to go in and out of the city by avoiding it. So that would be a little bit different case, because I don't know what the design that New York is going to go with, because as y'all have observed, the board appointments haven't been made, and I haven't seen a lot of details just from casually searching. So I don't know if it's going to be one that varies over the day, or if it's going to be once per day. Actually, if y'all know, that'd be interesting.
It sounds like it's going to be once per day, and
Like
it sounds
London,
like if you're traveling within the zone and not leaving the zone, you're not going to be charged. That's what I think.
Okay, so it's once per day, and it's only inbound. Then you're saying,
right? And then there are exemptions. For instance, I believe they're talking about exemptions for people coming in over the Port Authority bridges and tunnels on the west side of Manhattan.
Right.
So
those are the ones that go to New Jersey, right?
That's what's being debated. New Jersey is pushing to have those exemptions or offsets, and are making threats if they are not eventually provided.
Is that because they're already told?
Right. So people coming from New Jersey on a Port Authority bridge have to pay approximately, I forget what it is, $12 to cross, whether it's the Lincoln or Holland Tunnel within the congestion zone or the George Washington Bridge above the zone. And of course, those fees go towards Port Authority properties such as the port, the PATH train, the airports, but not New York City Transit, not the commuter rail systems that are under the auspices of the Metropolitan Transit Authority. So they are seeking major offsets, or a complete offset, or exemption from having to pay the congestion fee. And the reasons why that wouldn't make sense are the ones for which I just stated.
There are people who come into Manhattan. If you come from Staten Island, the Verrazano Bridge charges a fee. If you come in through the I forget, they named everything after people, so I'm not, the Ucary Tunnel, for instance, or the Midtown Tunnel, or the Triborough Bridge, there are tolls on all of this. Not all of or the Riverdale Bridge, the Henry Hudson Bridge.
Right.
Not all the bridges are tolled, but some of them are. So there's just an inequity there, and because the money doesn't go to the MTA, it's something that really concerns us. Sorry,
those
Craig.
bridges, the ones that you just mentioned, are MTA bridges.
Right, they're the Triborough Authority, and they're the ones that will be giving final approval to the rules promulgated under the board, right? The Transit Mobility Board.
Yes.
Yeah. So they are MTA bridges, and yet they're paying twice for the MTA if they're not exempted, and the Port Authority people are paying not at all for the MTA if they are exempted.
Right. So
those are issues, I think, that we've raised as being of concern. So But thank you so much for your time.
Thank
Now,
you.
I only asked you one question, so I'm
Okay.
wondering if you could stay for one question from a member of the board who has not yet spoken. Would that be possible?
Sure, yeah.
Rami, if you could keep your question brief, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Alita. I'm just going to add on, like, our taxi drivers are facing an unprecedented medallion crisis, in part due to the pandemic, but this has been the problem that's been years in the making, unfortunately, for our taxi drivers. And it does have to do with for hire, Uber and Lyft and all of those companies. And they themselves have their own labor issues. And my fear with congestion pricing is a serious harm on our taxi drivers and our Uber drivers, which often are the lifeline for people with disabilities to get around the city when the MTA fails, which it often does. And hopefully that changes with congestion pricing money. But my question is, the other cities that have examined this, how have they dealt with labor issues that result from congestion pricing, specifically with taxis and taxi medallions?
Yeah, so like I said, like the thing is that I think that it sounds to me like, so they already have this charge per ride, right, since January 2020. It sounds to me like that's like the charge that they're talking about with this would be like a once a day charge, but then that other one is like every ride that you do. So I would imagine that they would probably exempt the taxis, or if not exempt them, it's at the end of the day, it's like, $12 out of the day's revenue. So I don't know how big of a deal that is in the total revenue, but it sounds to me like since they already have another tax, I mean, I don't live there, but as far as how the other cities have dealt with it, I haven't read about being the taxi drivers being a big deal in the other cities, except for London, where it was contentious to make them pay. But like I said, I think that there was also all this Uber litigation that was kind of that was the main thing that they were focused on during the same era. So I don't know what will happen in New York City, but I haven't read a lot about the taxi drivers kind of advocacy during these.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Craig,
Well,
since you've been corresponding with Louis, you go right ahead.
no, I was going to say, we can't thank you enough, Professor Lee, for the presentation, for spending all this time just answering questions, providing, I think, clarity that many of our cast members were seeking. I'll just ask, would you mind sharing your presentation so we could post it on our websites?
Sure. I realized I didn't put a references page, so I'll link some of the papers, but also I wanted to say thank you to y'all for having me. And I'm actually gonna mail, I have a copy of this book because y'all seem very interested in London. I have a copy of this book that's all about, it's called The Politics and the Policy of the London Congestion Charge. It has a lot more detail than all right, this is in my paper and such. So I'll mail one of y'all that. It's because I was Googling it, and it's one of these exorbitant books now that is out of print and costs like $200 now. So I'll mail that y'all if anybody wants to read that one.
Well, thank you so much. We really
Thank
appreciate
you.
that. And next time you're in New York, please reach out to us.
Sure.
Yes, and I hope you notice people applauding in their little images.
Yeah, I noticed it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
All right.
very much for your time. It was a really great privilege to hear
That's
all of this
an
from you.
honor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Alita, you want to take a lead from here?
I think what's next on the agenda is next steps for the congestion pricing task force. We know the mayor's appointee. We don't know anyone else. We don't know if there's an intention to comply with the open meetings law, which we saw last night. We are now forced to comply with in full force, no redundancy intended. So So those are continue to be concerns, is having adequate representation, I think, as Sharon pointed out, on the Mobility Review Board. So let's talk about what's next. There's a mixed reaction among people in the public about whether the 60th Street around the bridge is fixed or not. Not talking about the guys on the street, but whether that's something that we should, not that we should pursue, but whether it may be possible for them to change it or not. And what do we do from here? Because do you know why, Craig, the mayor is in such a rush to get this going?
No, I think, I don't recall him being much of an advocate, and now all of a sudden, maybe it's a legacy thing, or maybe it's he doesn't have to face re-election and he's letting his real feelings come out. But I don't really, I can't speculate as to why he may now all of a sudden be all rah-rah about it.
And I, for one, would like to know more about what they intend with the revenue, that if we don't meet the figures, which I guess $1 billion is a lot less than 15 billion, but how often, if more than once, do they intend to release bonds? Is the $1 billion a year necessary in order to, I guess, pay interest or pay principal and interest on the bonds? What happens if that target is not met? And ironically, and I guess this has been realized by so many people, ironically, if they succeed in reducing congestion and putting people, at least people from cars, into subways and buses, that will raise the need to raise even more revenue somehow. And how is that go? What are they going to do about that? So those are my questions, but we could hear from Marco, Michelle, and Valerie about potential next steps, as well as if you have ideas about that.
Alida, if you allow me, and Craig, if you allow me, I think I had to raise a couple of issues because somebody else referred to my comments. Please, I would like to ask if I can comment about this, the issue that we raised, please.
I know you want to respond to the point about pollution coming from the buildings.
A couple of issues, so clarify. It's good so everybody understands. So thank you. The first thing is the pollution. It's true what he said, Reed. That is a greenhouse effect, but the bottom line is still the building is consuming a lot of energy. Michelle explained very well the issue of the change of the boilers. And the bottom line, again, is not the oil even, is the loads. The loads of the building have to be reduced. So again, the building. So the New York City said they're planning to reduce the greenhouse effect, the greenhouse emissions for 2050 to 80%. Right now, I build this kind of house because it's nothing hard to do it, and you almost not produce carbon emissions right now. The second part is he mentioned about Latin America. You know what they did in Latin America? It's true. They put up plates and they said one odd number and one pair numbers, one day and the other day. You know what they did over there? They bought 2 cars, even though I had to tell you, in Latin America, to buy a car is double or triple right here in the United States. So they do that. So this is a very poor concept. The other part that I had to mention is, yes, we have a new regulations in the zoning resolution that is waived any park regulations at below 96th Street. And the 4 is, we live in a delivery economy. I don't know if London has the same issues or the other cities that I mentioned. We have Amazons. Amazon, they use the street as a storage room, and then from then they deliver it. I think, Craig, you know very well this issue because they have been mentioned in transportation. And same as Fresh Direct or double parking. So this is the different kind of city. And the 5th is, yes, about the cars. The other day I was in one car, brand new, almost brand new, 2 years old. And the car reached one corner and the car stopped and the machine was off. So they do a lot of efforts to reduce emissions in the car. Now, if you're talking about the food carbon printing of I'm sorry, this is they call carbon footprinting. So that is basically what it is. If you buy bicycles from China, you increase all the type of pollution in the world. So on the other point that that I saw is this is 4, this is 6. Oh, we can create revenue for different ways. Let me put the best example right now. The President Donald Trump, he was upset with New York, and he said, "Okay, I'm not going to declare nothing in New York, nothing for you, New York, because you have been nasty with me." And they went to declare probably in better conditions in Florida. So what we had to do is probably to tax those people that make money right here. That will get, you can get more money. No, you don't have to let it go. Those people that they take money from here and they put it out. Same for Amazon, same for fresh directors. So these people, they take the money away from us. They destroy the small business. So that's what we have to do. So we have other choices or other alternatives rather with this congestion pricing. And I think this is pretty much what I would like to mention. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Marco. Okay, Michelle.
Yeah. First, let me say something that is of tremendous concern to me. It's a rhetorical question. I don't expect you all to answer. But is anybody else potentially mortified that we could be asked where we're going and that we would have to give an appropriate answer that some higher being would decide is a good reason for us to be in our car? I mean, that smells of something pretty problematic. We should not be demonized for having a car. It's nobody's business where we're going in our cars. There is no good place to go or bad place to go. It's only a matter of where we want to go. We are still free people. So I'd like all that to please be taken off the table. That is not us. That is not how we function. In terms of going forward, I would like to see, you say like next steps. Well, I think we all know what the next steps are, but whether or not we can achieve them is another story, because one of the next steps would be to get the MTA in here and explore what are their other revenue sources. You know, take a look, talk to economists, I mean, or who's ever doing their budgeting and how they're allocating their repairs and what's their 5-year plan and how is the congestion pricing revenue going to play into that. I mean, this very general concept that it's going to finance in some way the MTA. I mean, we don't even know that it'll be a dedicated revenue stream. For all we know, it'll go 1,000 other places. I don't know that anywhere in this congestion pricing bill it's going to say it's dedicated to the MTA. We don't know what this bill says. And I think that the next thing we have to do is get whoever we could get in here, any politician, state, federal, whoever, get them in here and tell us what are the details of this plan. And you tell me exactly where you're putting this money, how it's dedicated, and please give us some alternative ways that you could either trim your budget or raise money that can somehow mitigate against having this. And by the way, just because nobody knew, I think the round trip on the GW bridge is $17. Well, if you're a working person and you've got to pay $17 every day out of your, I mean, that's a lot of money. And now plus you're talking additional fees when you get into the zone. So, yeah, and all this is going to be passed on. Don't think anybody is going to get away with this. Don't think that if you don't use the zone, then it's not a problem for you. There isn't a truck, a trucker, a business, somebody who has a restaurant in the zone that has to come in and out every day. You can bet it will reflect on the prices. Everybody's going to be paying for this. And I have not been convinced that there will be a benefit. Nobody has convinced me because nobody knows what the plan is and can actually say that it's going to help in New York. I haven't seen the evidence. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. So in terms of that next step that you're referring to, I think Craig and I have been talking about getting someone with information from the state and the city levels to come in. We were talking about it for July. So I think September, there should be more information. And then just to add on to what you were talking about, Michelle, with there's no guarantee about where the revenue is going. I think I've mentioned that I was told by someone who actually sells lottery tickets that the money going into education is deemed, I guess, fungible, and a dollar goes in and a dollar comes out of the budget and goes someplace else. So the lottery was supposed to enhance education. I'm not sure that it has. And I think what we do need to make sure of is that any money going to the MTA is additional to the budget, and that the budget is not going to be affected by revenues that are increased through congestion pricing, because otherwise that would be taxation for no reason at all. That's just my personal opinion, but Craig, I think I don't see you on my screen. I hope you're nodding to getting someone from the MTA and the state to come back or to come in at all in the fall. Valerie?
Yeah, well, I was going to say we've been talking about doing that for a while, and I reached out to New York City DOT and I've been playing back and forth with them. I'm hoping to be able to have a conversation soon. So hopefully by the time we have our next meeting, which would be September at the earliest, but I think September may not even necessarily happen because the calendar is already entirely booked because we have so few days with the Jewish holidays and other obligations. But whenever it is, I sincerely hope that we will be able to have ideally both New York City DOT and MTA, Triborough Bridge Tunnel Authority representatives. Also, just to provide information on the George Washington Bridge tolls. Currently, it is $13.75 during peak periods, $11.75 during off-peak periods, and those are both if you have Easy Pass. If you don't have Easy Pass, it is $16.
You know what just as an aside, and I wonder if this would have any implication in the city. Easy Pass, when you go into another state, New York State's Easy Pass in New Jersey, other than the bridges, or Pennsylvania or Maryland, you don't get the same discount that residents of those states get using their own state's Easy Pass.
I believe that is correct.
Yeah, and that's been a big issue for the Automobile Association. If they're doing Easy Pass, will there be higher rates assessed for people who don't have a New York State Easy Pass, who have out of state plates? I mean, it didn't occur to me before, but just in hearing your toll numbers, it's just a question that I have. So I don't know what's up their sleeve.
Yeah, that's something I assume becomes a Traffic Mobility Review Board policy as well. It may be less of a concern when we're talking about central district tolling versus a bridge. But I again, pure speculation. I don't really know.
I don't either. Thanks though. I know you're working on getting people. Valerie?
Okay, first I wanted to thank the co-chairs. I missed the last task force meeting and I thought your minutes were incredible. I felt like I was there, and so I wanted to commend you guys for putting those together.
I'll just give the credit right to Craig. So,
and also,
I try to be detailed for that reason. I like.
They were awesome. They were awesome, and I think that it was really great tonight to have somebody come in and talk about the programs that people always throw out when we're talking about congestion pricing. So that I think that was really great. What I started to talk about last night, which I honestly didn't realize there was another congestion pricing meeting tonight, was, you know, when we had an earlier task force meeting, and we once again put forth a resolution saying that we were against congestion pricing, which I can't remember whether it was voted down or not. And I think I made the comment at that point that we should go at it again, because with all the money, hopefully, that will be coming from the federal government with respect to infrastructure, it may not be necessary. And then we had our illustrious mayor come out last week and say, oh, we need congestion pricing instituted by January 1st, 2022, because we've had flooding in the subways. But then I just want to give you a quote from the chief financial officer of the MTA, who says he doesn't share the mayor's urgency on congestion fees. quote, right now we're fronting the capital program with the sales tax monies that we have and the mansion tax monies that we have. We are not in a position now to really to be needing absolutely at this point in time the congestion pricing proceeds for the capital program. So I see the MTA saying, wait a second, we don't need this, we're doing great. And I think, quite frankly, in an election year for the governor, I mean, this program was pushed through at a time, I go back to Gail Brewer having an unbelievably great public hearing on this topic right before it was passed by the legislature. And the MTA did come that evening, basically told us that they had no intention of putting this money in a lockbox and all these other things that were happening. So I think, we should really think about saying, I mean, the MTA is basically saying, we don't want this, we don't need this, and we may not do this. But 2 comments about that. I think it's great, the evening said that in London and Milan, which are the 2 cities that I would say are the most like New York in comparison, have exemptions or discounts for residents, or it's free for their residents. This is like completely the opposite. We have people talking about giving exemptions to non-residents and charging residents the full amount. It's ludicrous. I go back to the example of beaches in New York, where if you live in the county where the beach or the town where the beach is, you get a free pass and everybody else has to pay $60. It's unheard of that you would have to pay to use your own streets. And I just want to circle back for next steps, because we've been talking a lot about this taxi surcharge. And I really think we need to focus on this, because this is so discriminatory. And when we've brought it up with our electeds before, they kept saying, well, congestion pricing is going to come in and we can probably address it then. Now with the MTA saying that they may not need this congestion pricing, we need to advocate for the people below 96th Street and these poor cab drivers for these incredible taxes, as Alita alluded to. You get into a taxi and it's like $3.50 plus the starting charge. So it's $6 when you get into the taxi. I mean, this is crazy for the elderly in our community who have to go from their homes to the hospital or to see a doctor. And again, I point this out, why should it cost people who live below 96th Street $3 more to come home from JFK? I mean, it's ludicrous. And we should not accept this. And we should be fighting it at every turn. I've looked at there's a document called Budget Watch, and it shows operating results for the MTA and all the toll revenues. And in April of 2020, because when COVID started, I called up some of the electeds to tell them that they should go in and get Cuomo to suspend the congestion pricing surcharge, because I really thought it was unfair, even more so during that period. They had anticipated that in April 20, the budget for these 4 higher value taxes to be at $150 million. In the month of April, that chart, the actual receive was like $33 million, whatever the number was. It was substantially off. And I just think that we need to address this, and we need to nip this in the bud now, because we have the MTA basically saying that they're relying on sales tax and mansion tax, and the New Yorkers who live below 96th Street are paying money to something that they're not even seeing a benefit for. And it's really unfair taxation. And we need to take a really, I think, aggressive stand to get this pulled back, because this is not helping anybody. And now that we have the Delta variant really rearing its head in New York, I think it's even more important that we give some protection to our elderly and allow them at least the option to get in a taxi that's not going to charge them $11 or $15 to go 4 blocks. It's just outrageous. And I think that should be our next step.
So well, Craig, I know that there's been, I believe that there was a resolution at least a couple of years ago, maybe even that Valerie had suggested about that particular taxi fare, but given the different circumstances, maybe it makes sense if someone wants to propose a motion. What do you think?
I'm just trying to, we definitely passed a resolution in that that requested that the fee on yellow cabs be eliminated.
We would have different whereas clauses now, given COVID and
Well, may I suggest something? Sorry to interrupt. Can't we just write a letter to our electeds that just basically says we need you to do something about this now?
We can, I think that may make more sense, where we attach our resolution and say, since the time of the resolution, the following circumstances have changed, and reinforces and heightens the need for this to take place. Maybe that's the way to go.
so let's take and that makes sense because there are different circumstances, but we already have a resolution. So let's just take a quick vote if we can, for the members of the board who are here. So Valerie, after you, it's Rami and then Billy. So if everyone could lower their hands and then just put up your hands again if you support the idea of that letter.
Wait, so if people are raising their hands on Zoom, is that considered a support the letter, or?
Isn't that how we vote? If you don't approve?
Well, typically I thought with letters, we don't necessarily vote on it. We'll see if anyone.
It's been a mixed reaction to that, but there are, I assume that you support the idea, Craig, and I do as well. And so there are 3 people who have not raised their hands, Billy, Rit, and Sharon. And there are, with at least with me, I don't know for you for sure, Craig, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And with you, if you were so inclined, it would be 6. Without you, it would be 5, which is still, would be 5-4 if you voted no. So it would seem that, at least to the people on the members of the board.
Well, I guess for me, it's a little nuanced, because I think I think the taxi fee is fundamentally not fair, and that we shouldn't be singling out taxis when we have other for-hire vehicles that are not city sanctioned and licensed. But at the same time, I do want to make sure that I'm not comfortable, once congestion pricing were to go into effect, for people to then be able to take a taxi to avoid a fee, and therefore encouraging people to use taxis and surface transportation other than buses or other modes of transit. So I just want to make sure that for me, that it's phrased in a way where we are talking about the fee that would that's specifically impacting taxis in general, and not having it incorporate our district because we're being singled out versus
right. That's right.
96 versus 60th Street
right.
issue.
Right. So, all right. Well, there seem to be enough people supporting that to be able to write a letter, as I think you've outlined, Valerie and Craig. So we'll do that. So that's one next step. And the other next step are having people coming in the fall. Okay, let's go back to Rami and then Billy. Rami?
Yeah. So I support a letter, but I definitely think as Valerie mentioned that, sorry, I'm out with the dog. That's why my background is terrible. But I think what Valerie mentioned is that the biggest thing facing our committee is that, and the city and the state, is that the biggest thing that we don't know, the biggest thing that we have is more questions than answers. We have nothing. So I would, at least I'm sure others agree, is that in our letter we should mention that like, hey, our board has X opinion on congestion pricing, but we need answers before we can come up with a resolution. But like, feel free to correct me because
I don't,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Why don't you finish?
No, I think that we should just mention to our elected that we need them to put some pressure behind this and say, we as a community, not just CB8, but the whole borough of Manhattan has a problem with congestion pricing, whether they support it or don't, is that we don't have answers to a lot of our questions.
I'm not sure that we could put that in this letter. That feels like it's beyond the scope of what we were talking about, but certainly we have lots of questions, and I think it doesn't feel that I think the argument about, I mean, this is just my opinion, but the argument about the taxis loses strength in terms of raising other issues about congestion pricing. And then there is a lot of support for congestion pricing, but you're absolutely right. As Michelle raised too, we don't have answers. We don't know the constitution of the board. We don't know how it's meeting. We don't know any of the rules. We don't know when it will be implemented or how it will be implemented or how they will look at people, or will they track people, or will it be different times of the day and night and weekends? And will there be, what exemptions will there be? And will they be across the board? I mean, you're right, probably 1,000 questions about this, but it feels like the letter is not necessarily the right place to ask them. Craig?
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, that was just an idea. I just wanted
No,
to see
you're
how you
right.
felt about that.
We have tons of questions, and that's why we invited Liz Kruger, and that's why Craig is talking to state and city people about coming in and seeing if there are. I don't know that they have any answers yet, because they need to know the questions to ask as well. Or otherwise, it's just going to be a chaotic disaster if they don't know how it's going to work. So. But thank you. I think raising that is always worthwhile. And then I think Billy, you were next.
Yep. So I was just going to comment that in terms of the MTA and their board met this week, they did announce that they're anticipating a $3.5 billion deficit in 2024 and 2025. They're contemplating service reductions. So I think even though they've received help from the federal government, they're still facing really difficult financial circumstances in the out years. And so from a pure revenue perspective, at least in my opinion, that congestion pricing is going to be necessary. Now we can get into the nitty gritty of, that's meant for their capital budgeting, and a lot of their shortfalls are in their operating budget. But at the end of the day, they desperately are going to need some funding. And so I just want to make sure that we're all kind of clear on what they're facing budgetarily. Regarding the next steps, I don't know whether Commissioner Soliman is someone who would attend one of our meetings or hear from us to hear some of our concerns, but given that he's the only member of the TMRB that we know of, if I'm correct about that, I'd wonder whether he would come to one of our meetings and hear our views.
I think that's a great idea, and I think it's definitely worth reaching out to him.
Yeah, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So I think we should. Yeah. And actually, I wonder, there are committees that meet in August, Street Life and Landmarks, if there are issues that come up. If he were willing to come in August, but not the fall when things increase in intensity and frequency, if that would be something we could have another task force meeting, but I guess just a question.
We can keep that as an option if he would be willing to join us.
Okay, well, Craig, you and I we'll talk about that offline. Yeah. But it's a good idea, Billy.
Right. And I was just going to say, in response to what Billy brought up, I was reading the same thing earlier today, that there is definitely the threat of service cuts in a few years because of the lack of revenues and the fare box revenue that has been generated over the past year and a half, and the anticipated continuing reduced level of fare box revenue that's going to be generated just because the return to transit, even once COVID is no longer the issue that it is now, is not expected to exceed 80% of previous levels of ridership. So between that and the ongoing issues, even on the capital side, it's not as if we don't need the funding. So that's what was in the news just over the past day.
Yeah, and just so, and the last point I wanted to make was, okay, next steps. How are we going to be most effective? I think as a board, we should anticipate that this TMRB is not going to have representation from people who really know our neighborhoods, even though we've asked for that representation in the past. So we may be at the forefront of actually speaking up for Community District 8 on this issue. And so what does that mean? I think if we could lay out the types of, call them exemptions or tweaks to congestion pricing that we would most like to see, I think that's how we can be most influential. So example, which the professor mentioned, is even if you have a congestion zone that starts at 60th Street, you would have a sort of somewhat a exemption zone or whatever you would end up calling it, that stretches a few blocks north of that makes sure that people aren't getting hit unnecessarily just because they're circling the block for some innocuous reason. And I know this was a bit of a contentious point for Michelle, but thinking about trips to hospitals and things like that, whether there's a way to structure this to keep that in mind, especially given the hospital corridor in our district. Again, we can look at what London and Stockholm did. That's laid out in the professor's paper. We could get into the details and we could potentially put that in. My view is that the more exemptions you have, the more this gets watered down. And we heard from the professor that cities that tried exemptions eventually walked them back because they created too much of a gaping hole in the congestion pricing scheme. But I think that's where we can be most influential. It's laying out what we think we most need to see and potentially putting that in a resolution or a letter.
All right, thank you, Billy. All right, I think we have Rit, and then I don't know if Valerie has anything to add, but I think we should try to wrap this up.
So let's go to Rit.
Yeah, thanks. And I will say, Billy just basically said much of what I was going to say, which is I think if rather than emphasizing the unknowns, because by definition they're unknown, for political reasons, of course, the law left most of the hard questions to this commission. I would 100% agree with the idea that if there are specific things we would like to see the commission do, we should say that, as opposed to just asking questions at a point when it's inevitable that right now the answer is, well, nobody knows because the decision hasn't been taken yet. So I think that would be the most effective use of time, frankly, even more than, I think that would be important to do before trying to talk to commission members, because if we do that, the commission members are going to be hearing a diverse set of views that are probably therefore not actionable, because he's going to hear some of us say we want congestion pricing, others say we don't want congestion pricing. But if we actually have a handful of specific things that are relevant to the district, we can hope to speak with one voice.
That's a good point. So I'm just wondering, not that the governor is listening to the mayor at all in terms of urgency, but I'm wondering, this is a task force, and you could all throw tomatoes at me if you want, with a finite, I guess, or part of our mission is somewhat diminished if this goes and when it goes into effect. I'm wondering, and Billy, you know that we did this with the Charter Commission task forces that we met several times in August. I'm wondering if it makes any sense, if things are ratcheting up in the fall, to just have a meeting in August, again, tomatoes, I get, to lay out at least some of our concerns about things to ask for. Because I think it makes sense that Rit is right. If we have laid out what we'd like to see, for the commissioners or the board members going into their first meetings, we're being proactive rather than reactive, and rather than saying, no, this is wrong because, we're saying this is right because, or this is what you ought to think about because, and that may get a better response. So
I agree entirely. So I think we need to figure out when we're having our next meeting and maybe hold off on inviting Mr. Soliman, and maybe that becomes a time where if we have any officials from New York City DOT or MTA who can help answer questions, and the other purpose of the meeting would be to try to come up with a resolution to address the issues that the Traffic Mobility Review Board would have to ultimately determine. That may be our best approach.
well, so we're not meeting probably in September because between the Jewish holidays and Labor Day, we lose a lot of days and we have a lot of committees on the board. So it's either August or October, and I leave it to everyone to think about what we'd like to do in order to have the most impact. You've heard my thinking.
Well, Michelle, I was going to give my thought, but
Yeah, well, I was going to just say, I think you need both. I think for your reasons of getting ahead of the action, the August meeting is good. For the reasons of getting as many people in, you know, you're not going to have the same amount of even well publicizing an August meeting. You're not going to have the same amount of attendees, but that doesn't mean we can't get any business done. And then again in October, because in October you'll have more information, and we will be able to get more attendees. So it's fine if you put both of them on the calendar. This is an important issue. It's moving very quickly. The only good news from my point of view is the governor doesn't seem to have an urgency about it. So from my point of view, that's a good thing. Others may not agree. And the mayor, although he flipped now, I don't think it's going to be the real priority for him. I don't think he's going to spend time pushing this thing. I think he's got a lot of other things to worry about. He's getting a lot of pressure from all sides. So, but anyway, I can't second guess what he's going to do. But from our point of view, moving forward, August and October, I think, is the way to go. And let's verify you are sending the letter that we just discussed, right?
Yes.
You said that's not the taxi. That's a different story, but you are doing that. So that's
yes. So
the other thing, Craig, if I could, just because
Yes.
you would be in the position to do it, and I have you online now, but what the concept that we talked about last night is completely, out of topic. But when we mentioned with reference to the landmarks committee about the building who is not compliant about egress, but yet fulfilled the landmarks committee obligation for appropriateness, I think you and Chuck verbally said you had no objection to alerting the DOB of the breach of egress in that building. So if I could just verify with you that you and
Michelle, couldn't you do that offline because it's 20 after 9?
No,
and
I'm done. I just wanted to respond to your meeting.
No, we didn't have an objection, and let's move on. I was just going to say, getting back to scheduling our next meeting, I was going to propose, let me know, Alita, if you agree with this, so we could tentatively plan for an August meeting, and obviously for sure an October meeting, and hopefully earlier in October, and we can talk to the board office about finding dates. I think we need to work through some of the issues that are yet to be determined when it comes to a meeting in August, and whether it would be in person or hybrid or remote, and what our obligations are and how that would enter into the equation as well. And whether people are even going to be, board members especially, will even be around in August if it is going to be in person, which at that point it may have to be, since technically it should be now. So I think we need to just work through those matters and just make sure that we're doing things in an appropriate and acceptable manner.
Yeah, oh, of course. I have some thoughts on that, but I'll keep them to myself and we'll figure it out.
Does that work for you, Alita, to tentatively plan on, and we'll work through those issues?
Yes. We have to do the right, in order to have any voice at all, we have to do it the right way. So otherwise they just discount us on procedure, and we don't want to lose on procedure. So yes, we'll figure it out and get back to everyone once we do. Valerie, do you have something else? Saida, would you unmute Valerie? Thanks.
Quickly, I mean, I still think that, I don't know when Liz is going to introduce her bill to do the hybrid meeting. So that may pass rather quickly, depending upon how fast this Delta variant is sweeping through. I think, they're going to have to do that. So if that happens quickly, maybe I don't want to lose Billy's idea of having Suleiman come in. If you figure out a day in October, I would just get them on their calendar now and plan for that. And we could always you could have a task force. We could submit comments or questions to you guys. And then we could have a quick, meeting prior to the October meeting. We could have 2 meetings in October. Let's say you plan for them to come at the end, and we could have like a quick meeting that overlaps with somebody else's meeting on the same night, and just do it.
Yeah, we'll definitely work through those issues. I'll just say that I think tonight is a perfect example of why having some flexibility in terms of the open meeting laws is so critical. We wouldn't have had Professor Lee zooming in from Illinois if we didn't have the suspension of the open meetings law that allowed us to do it this way. It's so much easier to bring in speakers and presenters and to even have attendance in general this way. And while from a practical standpoint, yes, we need to meet in person, it would be great if we're able to maintain some flexibility and options to allow us to be able to do more and have more people join us and participate.
Well, we should take the $5,000 grant that somebody was giving us the other night and buy some equipment so we could video stream in even at a live meeting.
We have a lot of video equipment that we bought to be able to do MNN stuff, and I wonder if that's usable for this. We also used to have Channel 13 come and tape all of our meetings, but certainly for attendance, for flexibility, for having people who are not based in New York come, or even if they are based in New York, when you take out the hour commuting time to get someplace, it makes people's schedules much more flexible.
So I'll make a motion to adjourn then.
Any seconds? Billy, okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and participating and thinking of next steps. And Craig and I'll be talking to each other. So having said that, good night. And I guess this is the last meeting of the summer, unless we see you in August unless Street Life and Landmarks. So with that, have a great rest of the summer and see you guys soon. Well, not that soon, but it'll seem like soon. And it was good seeing all of you last night too. I do mean it was like a party. It was really nice. So have a great summer, everyone. Craig, thank you. And
thank you, Alita.
Saida, thank you so much. I know you were on your own. Will was not here, so kudos to you. And talk to you guys. See you guys.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Bye.
Good night.